Silas Brant's fist came down on the table so hard the coffee cups rattled off the edge and shattered on the plank floor. Nobody moved to pick them up. "You will marry her," he said, "and you will do it before the end of the month." Colton stood across from his father in the ranch office, hat in hand, jaw tight. He was 29 years old and had spent his entire life watching this man crush everything that got in his way. Horses, hired hands, business partners, his own wife before she finally stopped breathing 3 winters ago. Colton had told himself 100 times he was nothing like Silas, but he stood there holding his hat like a boy waiting for permission to leave the room, and he didn't say a word. Outside the window, Elena Ashcroft sat on the top rail of the fence with her back straight and her eyes fixed on the distant hills. She didn't know yet what was being decided inside that office. She had ridden in that morning thinking she was answering a job inquiry. Housekeeper, the letter had said. Honest work. She'd brought her one good bag and a letter of character reference from the school teacher back in Mill Haven. She had no idea she was about to be handed over like a deed. If you've ever been sold for someone else's ambition, if you've ever had your whole future decided without your name even being asked, then you already know exactly what Elena felt when that office door finally opened. Welcome. Stay with me to the end of this story. And if you want more tales like this one, stories about people who refuse to stay down, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The office smelled like leather and tobacco and old wood, and Silas Brant filled it the way a storm fills a valley. Not by being large exactly, but by making everything else feel smaller. He was 61 years old, thick through the chest, with the kind of face that had stopped apologizing for itself decades ago. He ran the largest cattle operation in Calvary County, and he intended to run the largest in the territory before he died. And the only thing standing between him and that ambition was a land deal with Senator Aldous Price that required of all things a respectable married son. Price won't do business with a bachelor, Silas said, pouring himself another cup from the pot on the stove, unbothered by the broken cups on the floor. Says it speaks to character, stability. His daughter married young, his sons married young, the whole family's built around that idea. You want the northern grazing contracts or not? I don't want them, Colton said. You want them. Same thing. It's not the same thing. Silas set the cup down. He looked at his son with the particular patience of a man who had never once in his life actually changed his mind due to an argument. Her name is Elena Ashcroft. Father's dead. Mother's dead. No brothers, no inheritance, no land. She's been working as a bookkeeper and sometimes a school teacher since she was 17. She's 24 now. She's educated enough to satisfy Price's notions about refinement, and she's got nothing, which means she's got no family to make trouble and no other prospects to complicate things. You picked her like you pick a horse. I picked her because she's practical and she won't cause a scene. Silas picked up his cup again. You'll thank me in 5 years. Colton looked out the window at the woman on the fence rail. From this distance, she looked ordinary, dark hair pulled back, plain traveling clothes, sitting still in the way of someone who was used to waiting. He didn't know anything about her. He didn't want to know anything about her. That was the thing that sat worst with him, not the arrangement itself, which he understood was a business transaction and nothing more, but the fact that she was a real person out there on that fence, and she had no idea what was about to be handed to her. He put his hat on his head and walked to the door. Where are you going? Silas said. To tell her myself, before you do. He heard his father make a sound, not protest exactly, more like mild surprise, the way you'd react if a dog did something unexpected. Colton walked out. Elena heard the door and turned. The man crossing the yard toward her was not the one she'd expected. She'd assumed the ranch owner would be older, the way the name Silas Brant sounded old and immovable. This one was younger, lean through the shoulders, with a walk that suggested he was used to covering ground quickly and had stopped caring what it looked like. She stayed on the fence rail. Miss Ashcroft, he said, stopping a few feet away. That's me. She looked at him steadily. She had learned a long time ago that the first moments of any new situation were the ones that set the terms, and she had learned to hold herself still and let the other person reveal what they needed first. He took his hat off, which she noted. Most men in her experience didn't bother. My name's Colton Brant. I figured. He squinted. You figured. You've got the look of someone who grew up on this land, and you've got the look of someone who's about to say something he doesn't want to say. She tilted her head. So say it. He did. He told her straight. The deal with Price, the contract, the marriage arrangement, the fact that his father had already sent the letter offering terms before she'd even arrived. He didn't dress it up. He watched her face while he talked, and she gave him almost nothing to read, which unsettled him more than anger would have. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. So the housekeeper position, she said, wasn't real. I'm sorry. Was that your idea or his? His. She nodded slowly. She looked out at the land, rolling dry hills, scrub grass, the distant shimmer of what might have been water but was probably just heat. The Brant Ranch spread across more territory than she'd seen in one piece since she'd left the East, and even struggling, it was something. She could see that. What are the terms? She said. He blinked. The terms of the arrangement. What does your father offer? Colton pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. His father had prepared it, which told Elena everything she needed to know about how long this plan had been in motion. She unfolded it herself, read it twice without expression, refolded it. Room and board, she said, a small monthly allowance, use of the household, in exchange for presenting as a legitimate wife to Senator Price's satisfaction. She looked up. And if I refuse? He'll find someone else. I know he will. I'm asking what happens to me if I refuse. Colton was quiet for a moment. I expect he'd make it difficult. He knows people in Millhaven, people who gave you work. There it was. She'd half expected it. Men like Silas Brant didn't issue invitations. They issued consequences wrapped in the shape of invitations. She had no savings worth speaking of, no family left to fall back on, and Millhaven was small enough that one word from the right man could close every door. She climbed down from the fence rail. Standing on the ground, she was shorter than him by nearly a foot, but she looked up at him with the kind of directness that made the height difference feel incidental. I'll do it, she said, but I want something added to those terms. He waited. I want it in writing that I have access to the ranch accounts. The full accounts, income, expenses, contracts, debts, not summaries, the actual ledgers. Why? Because if I'm going to live here, I intend to understand where here stands. She held his gaze. And because I think this ranch is in worse shape than your father's letting on, and I'd rather know what I'm walking into than find out when it's too late. Colton stared at her. Then he put his hat back on. I'll talk to him, he said. He didn't say yes. He didn't say she was right. But he walked back toward the house without dismissing her, and Elena Ashcroft stood in the dry Texas wind and understood that she had just agreed to something that was going to be much harder than anything she'd done in her 24 years of difficult living. She also understood, for the first time since the letter arrived, that she might be able to make something of it. Silas Brant did not take the ledger request well. Elena heard him from the guest room where a ranch hand had shown her to wait. The walls of the old house were thick, but not that thick, and Silas's voice was the kind that carried through walls as a matter of principle. She couldn't make out every word, but she caught enough. Absurd, and she's not a partner, and who does she think? And then Colton's voice, lower, steadier, and then a long silence. The ledgers arrived in her room an hour later, carried by a boy of about 14 who looked extremely uncomfortable and set them on the table without meeting her eyes. She spent the rest of the afternoon reading them. By evening, she had a clear picture, and it was worse than she'd thought. The Brant Ranch was carrying debt on 3 separate cattle purchases from the previous 2 years, both of which had underperformed due to what the records listed vaguely as market conditions, but which Elena, reading between the numbers, could identify as systematic underpricing by the buyers. Someone was taking a cut they weren't entitled to. The breeding stock was aging without adequate replacement investment. The grazing rotation was inefficient. She could see it in the feed cost increases year over year. And there was a line item labeled Price Agreement, advance that represented a sum borrowed against the expectation of the northern contracts. The ranch wasn't just struggling, it was mortgaged against a future it hadn't secured yet. She closed the last ledger and sat in the early dark with her hands folded on the table. She thought about the schoolhouse back in Millhaven, the cold in that building in winter, the way the parents of her students looked at her. The school teacher, meaning the woman who hadn't managed to find a husband, meaning the woman who was one bad season away from being a burden. She thought about the two positions she'd applied for before the Brant letter arrived, both of which had gone to men. She thought about her father, who had spent 30 years being right about things, and dead broke because being right had never been enough without the power to act on it. She thought, I am not going to spend my life being right in a room where no one is listening. The wedding was held 12 days later in the small church at the edge of Calvary, with exactly 9 people present. Silas, Colton, 4 ranch hands who were there because Silas told them to be, the minister's wife, and Elena. She wore the best dress she owned, which was decent but not special. Colton wore a clean shirt and looked like a man attending a business transaction, which was accurate. Silas stood in the back with his arms crossed and the expression of someone watching a contract get executed. Elena said her vows clearly and didn't flinch. The Brant Ranch hands sized her up in the first week, with the casual efficiency of men who had worked outdoors their whole lives and had developed strong opinions about everything they could see and plenty they couldn't. Her name became the wife, said with a particular flatness. Not contemptuous exactly. The ranch foreman, a weathered man named Decker, was too careful for open contempt, but not welcoming either. She was an intrusion into a system that had been running badly for years, and systems resent interruption. She didn't push. She watched. She learned that the outfit ran about 1,100 head, down from 1,500 2 years prior. She learned that Decker had been with the Brants for 19 years and was loyal to Silas, with the particular loyalty of a man who had nowhere else to be. She learned that Colton knew how to work cattle. He was good with horses, patient with the animals in a way he wasn't always patient with people, but that he had learned to defer to his father's judgment on the business side, to the point where he'd essentially stopped having his own. She learned that the cattle buyers who came through, 2 men from a company called Harmon and Cade out of Abilene, arrived every quarter and left with numbers that didn't quite add up. She pointed this out to Colton on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks after the wedding, in the small sitting room they shared without particularly sharing, both of them reading by the lamp. The Harmon and Cade contracts, she said. They're paying below the district average by between 12 and 18% depending on the quarter. I ran the comparisons. Colton looked up from his paper. Where'd you get the district averages? I wrote to the Cattlemen's Association in Abilene and asked for their published rate records. She paused. They sent them. It took 4 days. He looked at her for a moment. My father negotiated those contracts. I know. The negotiation was 6 years ago, and the rates were reasonable then. They haven't been adjusted since, and meanwhile the standard rates have moved. She held out the paper with her figures. We're leaving somewhere between $900 and $1,400 on the table every year. He didn't take the paper immediately. There was something working behind his eyes. Not disbelief, she thought, but something more complicated. Reluctance, maybe. The reluctance of someone who had spotted the same problem themselves a long time ago and had decided not to look at it. He took the paper. I'll talk to him, he said. When? When it's a good time. When is that? He gave her a look that was not quite irritated, but moving in that direction. Elena. I'm asking because the next Harmon and Cade visit is in 11 days, she said. If you're going to renegotiate, you need to be prepared before they arrive. Otherwise, they'll run the same numbers, and your father will sign the same contract and will lose another year. Colton folded the paper and set it on the side table. I said I'll talk to him. She let it go. Not because she was satisfied, but because she had learned, at 12, when her father was still alive and raging against the unfairness of things, that pushing a man before he was ready to move usually just made him plant his feet. She went back to her book. She was already planning what she'd say to the Harmon and Cade men herself if Colton's conversation didn't happen in time. The conversation did not happen in time. It happened in a way, but not a useful way. Silas listened to Colton repeat Elena's figures with the expression of a man being told something irritating by someone he was not going to credit with the irritation. And then he said that the Harmon and Cade arrangement was built on trust developed over years, and that numbers on paper didn't account for relationships, and that was the end of it. Elena sat at the dinner table 2 nights later and watched Silas talk about the price contracts with the undisguised satisfaction of a man who believed the future was already arranged to his liking. And she thought about the debt and the aging breeding stock and the quarterly losses to buyers who had learned they could take whatever they wanted because no one on the Brant side was watching closely enough. She thought, something has to change. and he's not going to be the one to change it. The other ranching wives made their assessment of her at the monthly social gathering at the Caldwell house the following week. There were 7 of them, ranging from Mrs. Dora Hatch, who was 50 and had been married to a rancher for 30 years and wore that tenure like a badge, to young Clara Voss, who was 22 and clearly terrified of everything. They were not cruel to Elena. Cruelty would have required engagement, but the conversation arranged itself around her in a way that made her peripheral. References to history she wasn't part of. In-jokes she didn't understand. Evaluations of cattle and seasons and previous years that were meant to demonstrate how much they knew and how little she did. Mrs. Hatch asked her pleasantly what she'd done before coming to Calvary. Bookkeeping, Elena said, and teaching. Teaching. Mrs. Hatch nodded with the expression of someone who has just had a small suspicion confirmed. So, no cattle experience? No, Elena said, but I learned quickly. Mrs. Hatch turned back to Dora Caldwell and resumed what they'd been discussing before Elena arrived, which was whether the Oakes family would be able to hold their eastern pasture through the dry season. Elena ate her cake and listened. She learned that 3 ranches in the county were in serious financial trouble. The 2 of the Harmon and Cade buyers had been seen drinking heavily at the saloon in town the night before the last contract signing, which was interesting, and that the drought that had been threatening from the south for 2 months was now a confirmed fact. The Pedernales River was running low, and the old-timers were saying it hadn't been that low since 1871. She stored all of it. She had always been good at storing things. On the ride home, in the buggy beside Colton, she said, "The drought is worse than your father knows, or worse than he's admitting." Colton kept his eyes on the road. "He knows." "Then why isn't he adjusting the grazing rotation? Your east pasture is going to be stripped bare by September if you keep running the same numbers through it." Elena. He said her name with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been in an argument for weeks without either side ever speaking directly about it. "I know you see things in the numbers. I'm not saying you're wrong, but this ranch has been running for 22 years and there are things that don't show up in ledgers. Name one." He looked at her. She looked back. "Name one thing that matters to this ranch's survival that can't be tracked," she said. Not angrily. She genuinely wanted to know if there was something she was missing. He was quiet for a long moment. "I can't," he finally said, and it sounded like an admission he hadn't planned to make. The buggy moved through the dark. The land on either side was dry and still and enormous, the kind of enormous that made everything personal feel small. Elena looked out at it and thought about what it would take to save something this big. She thought about the wedding jewelry she'd brought, her mother's pieces, small and plain but real silver, sitting in the box on her dresser. She thought, if no one else is going to act, then it has to be me. She didn't say it out loud. But Colton, who had learned in 6 weeks of marriage to watch her face, seemed to sense that something had shifted. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking," Elena said carefully, "that I have some ideas, and that some of them are going to make your father very angry." Colton looked at the road ahead. "That's most ideas," he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite humor, but wasn't quite not either. Something she hadn't heard from him before. She filed that away too. The idea came to her at 3 in the morning, the way most real ideas do, not as a sudden flash, but as the slow accumulation of everything she'd been turning over for weeks, finally clicking into a shape she could see whole. She'd been lying awake in the room that was technically hers and technically his, and was really neither, listening to the dry wind move through the eaves, and she'd been thinking about the Pedernales running low, and the east pasture going thin, and the Harmon and Cade men who drank the night before signing, and the aging breeding stock and the debt, and the way Silas had looked at her figures with exactly the expression of a man who has already decided not to see what's in front of him. She got up and lit the lamp and sat at the small table with a blank sheet of paper, and she started writing. Not numbers this time. A map. Not a real map. She didn't have the surveying skills for that. But a diagram of relationships. Which ranches in the county were struggling and which were holding on and which had something to offer that they weren't currently using. Who owned grazing land that sat empty in the dry months because they lacked the cattle to fill it. Who had cattle but not enough land to rotate them properly. Who had good breeding stock going to waste because they couldn't afford the management costs of a serious program. who had access to trading routes that other ranchers couldn't reach because they were too small to negotiate directly. She drew lines between them, connection points, exchange possibilities, a system. By the time gray light started coming through the window, she had covered 4 sheets of paper and her hand was cramped, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the Brant Ranch's problem was not just the Harmon and Cade contracts, or the drought, or the aging bulls, or the debt. The problem was that everyone in Calvary County was running their operation as if they were alone in a world where being alone was a choice, when it wasn't a choice anymore. Maybe it never had been. She sat back and looked at what she'd drawn. It was either the best idea she'd ever had, or it was going to ruin everything. She genuinely could not tell which. She folded the papers and put them under the ledger and went to start the day. Well, she told Colton on a Thursday, in the barn, because that was where she'd found him, and she'd decided that waiting for the right moment was a way of never acting. He was checking a horse's foreleg. One of the working mares had come up lame the day before, and he looked up when she came in with the folded papers in her hand. "You're going to want to sit down for this," she said. "I'm fine standing." "Suit yourself." She spread the papers across the top of a feed barrel and walked him through it. Grazing network first, she'd identified 4 ranches within a 30-mile radius that had underused land in different seasonal patterns, meaning that cattle moved between them in the right sequence would never be on depleted grass. Then the breeding program. Pool the best stock from 3 ranches, rotate the genetics, share the management costs, share the results. Then the trading piece. Instead of each ranch negotiating separately with buyers like Harmon and Cade, they'd go together. Combined volume, combined leverage. The buyers couldn't undercut all of them simultaneously. There'd be nowhere else to go. She watched his face while she talked. He looked at the papers. He looked at her. He looked back at the papers. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she started to feel the particular anxiety of someone who has laid everything out and is waiting to hear if it sounds as reasonable out loud as it did at 3 in the morning. "How long have you been working on this?" he said. "Seriously? A few weeks. Thinking about pieces of it since I read the first ledger." "Which ranches?" "Oaks, for the eastern grass. Harlan Cooper up by the ridge. His land is high enough that it stays cooler, better grazing in July and August when everything else is burning. And the Voss outfit, small, but they've got 3 exceptional breeding bulls they can't afford to campaign properly. Jesse Voss thinks I stole water rights from him 6 years ago." "Did you?" "My father did." He paused. "More or less." "Then apologizing is probably part of the process." He made a sound. "My father doesn't apologize." "I know, you would be." He looked at her. There was something shifting in his expression. Not agreement exactly, more like a man who has just realized the floor of a room he's been standing in goes deeper than he thought. He picked up one of the papers and turned it over in his hands. "What about Silas?" he said. "He'll say no." "Then what's the point of—" "He'll say no to you," she said carefully. "He might not say no to the math. Not if the math is presented at the right time, in the right way, by someone he can't dismiss as being too involved to see clearly." "Meaning?" "Senator Price is coming in 6 weeks for the contract review. Your father wants to impress him. If we can show Price that the Brant operation is already leading a regional consolidation, that Silas's ranch isn't just surviving the drought, but is the center of a network that's growing, that's more impressive than one ranch holding on. Price deals in scale. He'll respond to scale." Colton set the paper down. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, the gesture she'd come to recognize as him working through something he hadn't fully rejected yet. "Elena," he said, "if this goes wrong, I know. No, I mean specifically, if you approach the Oaks family and the Coopers and the Voss outfit, and they talk, which they will, and word gets back to my father before we've framed it properly, he'll shut it down and he'll be angry enough that it won't just be shut down, he'll make things difficult for both of us, but especially for you." "I know," she said again. "I've thought about that." "And?" She looked at him steadily. "And I've thought about what happens if we do nothing. The drought gets worse. The Harmon and Cade men come back in September and take another cut we can't afford. The breeding stock gets another year older without investment. By spring, you're selling off cattle to service the debt instead of building the herd." She folded her hands on top of the papers. "So the risk of doing this is that your father gets angry and makes things hard." The risk of not doing this is that the ranch fails. Those aren't equal risks. He didn't answer right away. The mare shifted in her stall and blew a long breath through her nose. I'll talk to the Coopers, he said finally. Harlan Cooper and my father have bad history, but Harlan and I get along. Let me feel it out before you approach anyone directly. How long? Give me a week. A week, she agreed. She gathered the papers. He turned back to the mare's leg. She was nearly to the barn door when he said, without looking up, the part about approaching Price directly. That was smart, using his visit as the deadline. She paused. Thank you. I didn't say I agreed with the rest of it. I know, she said, but you didn't say you disagreed either. She walked out into the hard morning sun. Behind her, she heard him make that almost sound again, the one that might have been a laugh and might not have been, and she filed it away with everything else. Decker found out on the 5th day. She wasn't sure how. She'd been careful. Colton had been careful, visiting Harlan Cooper under the cover of checking a shared fence line, but a ranch operates on a web of small observations, and Decker had been watching her since she arrived with the particular attention of a man who understood, at some animal level, that she represented change. And Decker did not like change. Decker liked 19 years of knowing exactly where everything stood. He came to find her in the kitchen, where she was working through the feed cost projections she'd been revising based on the new grazing rotation figures. Mrs. Brandt, he said, with the emphasis that made clear he found the title incongruous. Decker. He sat down across from her without being asked, which told her this was going to be direct. She set down her pencil. I hear Colton was up at Cooper's place this week, he said. I wouldn't know his schedule better than you would. I hear it was about some kind of arrangement, grazing agreement maybe. You hear a lot. He put both hands flat on the table. He had the hands of a man who'd been working cattle for 40 years, scarred across the knuckles, permanently darkened at the creases, tremendously capable. Ma'am, I mean this respectful. This ranch runs the way it runs because Silas Brandt built it that way. Whatever you think you see in those ledgers, there's 20 years of decisions underneath those numbers that you weren't here for. I'm sure that's true. Then you understand why coming in with a new plan after 8 weeks, 6 weeks, he paused, 6 weeks. Why coming in after 6 weeks and trying to reorganize the operation is not something I can stand behind. She looked at him. I was not a bad man, she had decided. He was a man shaped entirely by loyalty to something that was failing, and that made him dangerous in the particular way that well-meaning people become dangerous when the thing they're protecting stops deserving protection. Decker, she said, what do you think happens if we go into next spring with the same contracts, the same grazing rotation, and a drought that's still getting worse? He shifted. We've weathered bad seasons before. Name the last time you had 3 consecutive bad quarters and came out the other side without selling cattle. He didn't answer. I've read every ledger back to 1868, she said. The ranch has had hard seasons. It's never had this particular combination of problems at the same time. And it's never had them while carrying this much debt. She leaned forward. I'm not trying to tear down what Silas built. I'm trying to save it. Those are not the same thing. Decker stood up. He picked up his hat from the table. I'll tell you something my father told me, he said. He said, be careful of smart people who are sure they're right, because being sure isn't the same as being correct. That's fair advice, she said. I'll keep it in mind. He left. She picked up her pencil. 2 hours later, she heard him in the yard talking to one of the hands, and she caught 3 words clearly through the window. The wife's planning. She kept writing. Harlan Cooper agreed to a meeting. That was the first real thing. He came on a Sunday, which felt deliberate. Sunday had a neutrality to it, an implication of goodwill that a weekday couldn't carry. And he sat at the kitchen table with his hat between his hands, and the air of a man who had been told enough to be curious and was reserving judgment until he heard the rest. He was in his mid-40s, raw-boned and weathered, with a careful way of listening that Elena recognized from her father, the listening of someone who had been burned by moving too fast and had since made a discipline of patience. She laid it out for him as she had for Colton, but cleaner. She'd had more time to refine it, cut the parts that sounded theoretical, sharpen the parts that were concrete. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Your Northern Ridge pasture, she said. 600 acres you're running 120 head on, which is under capacity. If we rotate 200 of the Brant cattle through there in July and August, I run my own operation, he said. Not angry, stating a fact. I know, this isn't a merger. It's a use agreement. You set the terms for access to your land, you receive a fee per head per month, and at the end of the season, your land is in the same condition it started in. Better, if we manage the rotation right. She slid a paper toward him with the numbers. Based on last year's rates, that's between $400 and $500 over the summer months. For land you're currently underusing. He looked at the numbers. He was quiet. The breeding piece, he said. Tell me about that. You have 3 solid cows out of the Tucker bloodline that you've been crossing with the same bull for 3 years. The offspring are showing reduced vigor. I suspect you've noticed. His jaw tightened slightly. I've noticed. The Brant Ranch has a young bull out of the Gonzales stock in San Antonio. Good conformation, strong on the hoof. Cross him with your Tucker cows and you get hybrid vigor. Better birth weight, better survival rate, better market weight at 2 years. She paused. The Cooper Ranch gets improved breeding stock without the cost of buying a new bull. The Brant operation gets access to Tucker bloodlines we don't currently have. It's not charity in either direction. And if I say no to the whole thing, then I thank you for coming and I look at other options. Who else are you talking to? I'd rather not say until agreements are in place. I don't want anyone's decision to be based on who else is or isn't involved. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Colton, who had been sitting at the far end of the table and had, to his credit, said almost nothing. She always like this? Harlan said. Colton appeared to consider the question seriously. Pretty much from the first week. Harlan looked back at Elena. My father and Silas Brant have not spoken in 11 years. I know, that's between them. She held his gaze. This would be between us. Something shifted in his face. Not enthusiasm. He wasn't a man who showed enthusiasm, but the particular realignment of a man who has decided to stop looking for reasons to say no. I want 2 weeks to think on the specifics, he said. Of course. And I want to see the full proposal, written, with the numbers laid out clearly. I'll have it to you by Wednesday. He stood, put his hat back on, nodded once to Colton, and left. The kitchen was quiet. 2 weeks, Colton said. He'll decide in 1, she said. He's the kind of man who asks for more time than he needs, so he doesn't look impulsive. You got all that from 1 meeting? And from his face when I mentioned the Tucker cows. She started gathering the papers. He's been worrying about that breeding problem for a while. Probably longer than he's willing to admit. When someone offers you a solution to a problem you've been carrying alone, you don't need 2 weeks. Colton was quiet for a moment. My father is going to find out about this. I know. Before we're ready. Probably. And then? She looked up. Then we'd better make sure the numbers are good enough that finding out doesn't matter. Silas found out on a Wednesday. Not from Decker, from Aldous Price himself, who had apparently heard through one of his land agents that the Brant operation was in conversations with neighboring ranches about some kind of cooperative arrangement, and who had written a letter asking Silas to clarify the nature and scope of the plan before his upcoming visit. Elena was in the sitting room when she heard the front door, and then Silas's voice, and then a quality of silence that meant something had crossed a line. She stood up. He came into the sitting room with the letter in his hand and the expression of a man who has been publicly embarrassed by someone in his own household and has not yet decided what to do about it. She had learned in 2 months of living under this roof that Silas Brant's anger was not the explosive kind. It was the pressurized kind, the kind that spoke in full sentences with perfect control and was worse for it. Sit down, he said. She stayed standing. I'd rather not. His eyes moved to her with a sharpness that she understood was a warning. I said, I heard you. She kept her voice even. I'd rather have this conversation standing. He looked at her for a long moment. He put the letter on the table between them. You went behind my back, he said. I made preliminary inquiries about a business proposal. I intended to present it to you before any agreements were finalized. You contacted Harlan Cooper. Colton contacted Harlan Cooper. I prepared the proposal. Don't parse words with me. His voice stayed controlled, which was somehow worse than if it hadn't. I built this ranch for 22 years. I know every man in this county, every agreement that's ever been made on Brant land, every handshake and every argument. "You have been here for 8 weeks." "9," she said, "and I know the ledgers for all 22 of those years." Something moved across his face. Not quite anger and not quite respect and not quite anything she could name cleanly. "The ledgers tell a story," he said. "They don't tell the whole story." "You're right," she said, and it caught him off guard because he'd been preparing for argument. "The ledgers don't tell me why you trust Harmon and Cade. Despite consistent evidence they're undervaluing the herd, they don't tell me what the relationship is there or what it's built on. I'd genuinely like to understand that." He was quiet for a moment. It was the first time she'd seen him actually pause. "Walt Harmon helped this ranch through a season in '71 when we had nothing left," he said. "He bought at fair price when no one else would touch us. When a man does that, you don't forget it." "No," she said, "you don't. That's a real thing. And Walt Harmon probably deserves more from this ranch than a buyer who undercuts us by 15% every quarter." She paused. "But Walt Harmon retired in 1876. The men who come here now are his nephew and a hired agent who've never met you and don't know that history and are just taking what they can get because no one's told them not to." He stared at her. She picked up the letter, carefully, keeping her eyes on him, and slid the pages of the proposal out from behind it, where she'd placed them that morning when she'd seen Decker ride toward the main house and had understood, with the particular clarity that follows inevitability, that this conversation was coming. "Read the proposal," she said. "All of it, and then tell me where I'm wrong." She put it on the table and left the room. Her hands were shaking when she got to the kitchen. She stood at the sink and breathed. Outside, the yard was ordinary. A hand crossing toward the barn, 2 horses at the rail, the dry sky pressing down on everything. She had either just saved something or ended it. She genuinely could not tell. Colton found her in the barn an hour later. She was brushing one of the mares for something to do with her hands, working in long strokes from shoulder to flank, and he stood in the door and watched for a moment before he spoke. "He's reading it," he said. She kept brushing. "Is he angry?" "He's always angry, but he's reading it." He came in and leaned against the stall. "You put it behind his letter. You planned for him to find it that way." "I planned for the possibility." "Elena." There was something in his voice, not quite frustration and not quite admiration, the two things so close together in him that she'd stopped trying to separate them. "Would you tell me just once, when you're 3 moves ahead of everyone? So I don't feel like an idiot when I find out." She stopped brushing. She looked at him. "You're not an idiot." "I feel like one." "That's different." She went back to the mare. "You defer to your father because you grew up learning that deferring was the only way to survive in this house. That's not idiocy. That's adaptation." She paused. "But it's also not going to be enough anymore. The situation is past where deference helps." He was quiet. "If he says no to the proposal," she said, "what's your position?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you fight for it, or do you let him say no and go back to the way things were?" He didn't answer right away, which she'd learned was usually more meaningful than a fast answer. "I was looking at the mare, at the brush moving through the animal's coat, at nothing in particular." "I think the proposal is right," he said finally. "I think you're right, about most of it." He paused. "I don't know if I'd fight for it on my own. I've never been good at fighting him." "I know." "But—" He stopped, started again. "But if you're the one standing there, I think I could hold the line, if it came to that." She looked at him. He was not looking at her, which she thought was probably honest. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" "Okay," she said it again. "That's something to work with." He nodded. He pushed off the stall and turned to go, and she said, "Colton." He turned back. "Thank you for going to Cooper and for not closing the door before I could get to him." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she didn't entirely recognize, complicated and a little exposed, the way people look when they've been thanked for something they did, half out of doubt and half out of something else they're not ready to name. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "He hasn't said yes." Silas said neither yes nor no for 4 days. Those 4 days had a particular texture. The ranch continued its ordinary routines. Decker gave her a wider berth than usual. The hands did their work and watched the house the way ranch hands watch any building where something is being decided. Elena continued her projections. She wrote the final version of the Cooper proposal and sent it. She drafted a preliminary letter to the Oaks family, which she did not send yet. She waited. On the fourth night, Silas appeared in the doorway of the sitting room where she was working, just as she'd appeared in his office 2 months ago. He didn't sit down either. "The part about Harmon and Cade," he said. "You're saying we renegotiate, not terminate." "Renegotiate," she said. "Bring in the updated district averages. Give them the choice to match fair market or lose the contract. My guess is they'll match. They don't want to lose a reliable operation of this size. My guess is Walt's nephew will get his back up and walk. That's possible. In which case we negotiate with 3 other buyers who are already in the region. I've made inquiries." He was quiet. "The You'd manage it?" "I'd oversee the records and the rotation schedule. Colton would manage the animal side." Something shifted. Slight, but she caught it. The mention of Colton managing something. "And Cooper," he said. "Harlan Cooper has the best ridge pasture in the county, and he's willing to use it. The history between your families is real. This doesn't erase it, but it's separate from a business arrangement. He'd require a formal agreement." "He would. I've drafted one." He looked at her with an expression she'd seen on exactly 3 people in her life. Her father, when she'd solved a problem he'd considered unsolvable. The school board chairman in Mill Haven, when she'd balanced books he'd been told were impossible to balance, and no one else. "You drafted an agreement," he said. "I can show it to you." He stood in the doorway for another moment, and then he did something she had not seen him do in 9 weeks. He pulled out a chair and sat down. He put both hands on the table. "Show me," he said. Elena reached into the ledger and pulled out the papers. Outside, the dry wind moved through the eaves like it always did, and somewhere in the yard a horse shifted and stamped, and the lamp on the table threw their shadows against the wall in long, overlapping shapes. And Elena Ashcroft, who had arrived at this house with nothing but her mind and her mother's jewelry and a letter she hadn't been meant to read clearly, spread her work across the table and began to explain it to the man who had tried to make her invisible. He didn't agree with all of it that night. He pushed back on the Cooper terms and said the Oaks approach was premature and questioned 2 of her projections with enough specific knowledge that she had to revise one of them on the spot, which she did without flinching. But he didn't say no. And by the time the lamp burned low and the house had gone quiet around them, they were still at the table, and the papers between them had her pencil marks and his, and that was the first real thing. Not agreement, not trust, not anything that could be named cleanly. Just 2 people working the same problem for the first time in the same direction. In the room down the hall, Colton lay awake listening to the sound of their voices. Low, clipped, occasionally sharp, occasionally something that might, from a distance and in the dark, sound almost like conversation between equals. And he stared at the ceiling and thought about what it would mean if this worked. What it would mean for the ranch, and for his father, and for the woman he'd been handed like a transaction, and who had, in 9 weeks, managed to become the most formidable person in a house full of formidable people. He thought about what she'd said in the barn. That's something to work with. He closed his eyes. Outside, the drought pressed down on the county like a hand, patient and indifferent, and the Pedernales ran lower than it had in 50 years. And in the darkness between the Brant Ranch and the Cooper Ridge and the Oaks Eastern Pasture and all the failing operations scattered across the dry hills of Calvary County, something was beginning. Something that didn't have a name yet and wouldn't for a while. Something that looked from the outside like a business arrangement and was, from the inside, the first careful architecture of a different kind of future. It was fragile. It could still collapse in a dozen ways. Elena knew that better than anyone. But it was there. She had made it there. And that, for now, was enough to keep working. The Cooper agreement was signed on a Thursday in October, with Harlan Cooper's signature sitting beside Silas Brant's on the same page, which was something nobody in Calvary County would have predicted 2 months prior, and which Decker witnessed with the expression of a man watching weather he doesn't understand move in from a direction he wasn't watching. The Oaks family came in 2 weeks after that. Then a smaller outfit called the Meridian Spread, run by 2 brothers named Caswell, who had good land but poor management and were desperate enough to admit it. By the time Senator Price arrived for his visit in early November, Elena had 4 signed grazing agreements, a preliminary breeding pool with 3 participating ranches, and a renegotiated contract with Harmon and Cade's regional agent, not Walt Harmon's nephew, who had indeed gotten his back up and walked, but a buyer out of Fort Worth named Garrett, who had looked at the combined volume Elena was offering and agreed to rates within 2% of the district average without significant argument. Price was a small man with large opinions and the particular confidence of someone who had spent 30 years having his opinions confirmed by people who needed something from him. He walked the ranch with Silas on the first morning and listened to Silas describe the network Elena had built, using the word we, with a consistency that would have been remarkable to anyone who'd been in that sitting room 9 weeks ago. Elena was not present for that walk. She had not been invited, and she had not asked to be. Colton found her afterward in the east pasture, where she was walking the fence line with a notebook, recording the grass condition at different points along the rotation. "He's impressed," Colton said, falling into step beside her. "With your father?" "With the network. With the scope of it." He paused. Father told him it was a coordinated strategy he'd been developing for 2 years. Elena wrote something in her notebook. "That's fine. It's not accurate. It doesn't need to be accurate. It needs to be convincing." She kept walking. "Does Price want the northern contracts? He's signing them Friday." "Then it worked." Colton was quiet for a few steps. "It bothers you less than it should." She looked up at him. The autumn light was thin and clear, the kind that shows everything without flattering anything, and in it she looked tired in a way she hadn't let herself look inside the house. "What bothers me," she said, "is the east pasture losing another inch of topsoil every week because the drought hasn't broken, and we're still running too many head through the rotation. What bothers me is that the Caswell brothers signed the agreement but haven't moved their cattle to the northern section the way they committed to, which means we're going to have a bottleneck problem in December." She looked back at her notebook. "Your father taking credit for the strategy is the least of my concerns right now." He watched her write. "You're keeping score, though," he said. "Somewhere." She didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. Plum. The winter came early and mean. It came the way bad winters announce themselves on the frontier, not with a dramatic first storm, but with a slow withdrawal of warmth, a tightening of the air, a series of gray days that were each individually unremarkable, but which accumulated into something different. By the first week of December, the Pedernales was not just low, but frozen at its upper reaches, which hadn't happened in anyone's living memory, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single night and stayed there. The cattle knew before the people did. They bunched and shifted, facing away from the north wind, and the experienced hands read that bunching the way you'd read a barometer. The tighter they grouped, the worse what was coming. What came was the worst winter in 40 years. It hit the second week of December with a blizzard that lasted 3 days, dropped 4 feet of snow across the high country, and froze every water source from the ridge pastures down to the valley floor. When it broke, the sky cleared to a blue so sharp it hurt to look at, and in that sharp, bright cold, Elena stood on the porch and looked out at a landscape that had become fundamentally different overnight. The problem was immediate and specific. Roughly 600 cattle from 3 ranches, the Brant herd's rotation through the Cooper Ridge pasture, combined with the Caswell brothers' stock that hadn't been moved when it should have been, were trapped on the wrong side of the frozen Clearwater Creek, which had been a manageable water crossing 3 weeks ago and was now a solid, impassable wall of ice 3 feet thick in the shallow sections and deeper where it curved. They had feed for perhaps 9 days if they rationed. The temperature was not going to rise enough to break the ice for at least 2 weeks, possibly 3. 600 cattle dying of starvation on the Cooper Ridge would not just end the Brant network. It would financially destroy 3 families and personally ruin every relationship Elena had spent 5 months building. She was in the kitchen doing the arithmetic when Colton came in from outside with ice in his beard and his face pulled tight from cold. "The Clearwater's solid all the way to the Meridian Junction," he said. "I rode the full length." "I know. We can try to cut through it at the shallow bend. I rode it this morning. The shallow bend is 4 feet deep. We'd lose 2 horses breaking through it and maybe not make it anyway." She was looking at a piece of paper with a rough sketch on it, not elegant, drawn in the dark before dawn. "There's another way." He looked at the sketch. "That's the Alderman Pass," he said. "Yes." "Elena, I know what people say about it. People say it because it's true. That pass hasn't been used for a cattle drive since nobody uses it. The grade on the eastern face is too steep. There's no reliable water on the route. And in winter, the southern exposure keeps the grade clear of the worst drifting," she said. I talked to an old trapper named Hicks who camps in the valley below it. He says there's a route along the southern face that stays navigable even in hard winters because the rock overhang breaks the drift pattern. She paused. He's been through it twice, both times in winter. He's a trapper. He wasn't moving 600 cattle. No, he wasn't. So you're proposing... I'm proposing we move the herd through Alderman Pass to the Brant South pasture before we lose them. She looked at him directly. The South pasture has the windbreak, and we've got feed stored there. It's a 2-day drive if the weather holds. If it doesn't hold, then we lose some cattle in the pass instead of all of them on the ridge. She spread her hands flat on the table. Tell me another option. He stood there with ice still melting off his coat and looked at the sketch and looked at her, and the particular silence between them was the kind that forms when a person realizes they've been asked a question they cannot answer. Silas will say no, he said. Silas is in town with Senator Price finalizing the last document of the Northern contracts. He doesn't know yet. She folded the paper. By the time he knows, we'll either be through the pass or we won't. Colton stared at her. You want to do this without telling him? I want to do this before we have a 2-day argument that ends with 600 cattle dead on a frozen ridge. If it goes wrong, Colton. Her voice was steady, but underneath it something was very close to breaking, because she had been awake for 36 hours, and she had done the numbers 6 ways, and this was the only one that worked, and she knew it was also the one most likely to destroy everything she'd built, and she was doing it anyway because there was nothing else to do. If it goes wrong, I'll take the responsibility. All of it. Your father, the Coopers, the Caswells. I'll tell them it was my decision and mine alone. She looked at him. But I need you to ride with me. I can't do this part without you. He took his hat off. He put it on the table. He picked it up again. How many hands do you need? He said. She needed 8 and she got 6 because 2 of Decker's most experienced men refused outright when they understood the route. And Decker himself stood in the yard with his arms crossed and said flatly that he would not be party to driving cattle up a mountain in December, and Elena looked at him and said, That's your right, and turned and kept moving. Hicks the trapper came with them, which was worth 2 experienced hands on its own. He was 70 if he was a day, small and brown and almost weightless looking in his heavy coat, and he knew the southern face of Alderman Pass the way a man knows a room he's slept in 1,000 times, by feel, by instinct, by the particular language of stone and wind and grade that only comes from long, intimate acquaintance. They started at first light the next morning. The first 3 hours were manageable. The cattle were hungry and cold and moved with the focused urgency of animals that understood, at some level, that standing still was worse. Colton rode point with 2 of the hands, Hicks took the lead up front where the rote began to rise, and Elena rode drag with the remaining hands, keeping the rear of the herd moving, pushing the stragglers, watching for the animals that started to flag, and marking them mentally because a flagging animal at the back of a herd on a mountain trail was a problem that could cascade fast. The grade began 4 miles in, and it was steeper than the sketch had suggested. Not impossible. Hicks had been honest about the angle, but steep enough that the cattle felt it and slowed, and Elena felt the drag increase behind her and knew they were at the first real decision point. Push harder and risk spooking the rear animals into each other, or hold the pace and risk losing the weather window that Hicks said would close by early afternoon. She pushed. Not recklessly. She did it by reading the animals. Which ones responded to pressure, and which ones would balk if pushed too hard. And she moved along the drag line, talking low, applying pressure selectively, keeping the mass of the herd moving without letting it feel like a stampede. She had read about this in a cattleman's manual she'd found in Silas's library the second week after arriving. Read it the way she read everything, which was completely and with attention to things that might not matter for months and then suddenly matter enormously. The manual had said, a herd on difficult terrain behaves like water. It finds its level. Your job is not to force it, but to shape where it goes. She'd read that at 2 a.m. in October and thought it was probably too simple. She understood it now. By mid-morning, they were halfway up the southern face, and the sky was still clear, and the cold was fierce, but not moving, and Elena let herself think for approximately 45 seconds that this might actually work before the first shot was fired. It came from the tree line to the east, a single crack that bounced off the rock face above them and split into echoes, and the cattle nearest the sound shuddered, and the hands closest to them pulled their horses tight, and for 3 long seconds everyone held still, waiting to understand what had happened. Then a second shot, and this one was close enough that Elena heard it move through the air, and the rear of the herd broke. Not fully. Not a stampede. They were hemmed by the terrain, the mountain on one side and the drop on the other. But 50 or 60 animals at the back surged forward into the middle of the herd with the blind panic of creatures that understand danger without understanding its source, and the whole mass compressed and shuddered. And for a moment it was entirely possible that it would fold on itself, and they would lose everything to a mountain panic. Elena didn't think. She rode hard along the outside edge of the surging animals, parallel to the movement, her horse sliding on the icy ground and recovering, and she got in front of the surge and turned her horse broadside and stood her ground and screamed. Not words, just sound, loud and immediate and human, the kind that cuts through animal panic because it is itself a kind of panic. And the lead animals in the surge hit that wall of sound and horse and slowed, and then the ones behind them slowed and the compression eased. Her horse was trembling. She was trembling. She did not stop moving. "Where it?" she called to the hand nearest her. He pointed. East tree line, 200 yards, a gap in the pines where the shots had come from. "Keep them moving," she said, and she turned and rode toward the tree line. She found 2 men in the trees. She recognized one of them. His name was Rourke, and he worked for a man named Casper Dillard, who ran the largest single-owner cattle operation in the adjacent county, and who had been notably absent from every conversation Elena had tried to initiate about the network in the preceding months. Dillard had not been hostile. He'd been pleasant, in the way of men who have already decided they don't need to be anything else, because they're large enough to ignore you. Rourke was holding a rifle, and the other man was holding a rifle, and they were both looking at her with the particular expression of men who had expected this to go differently. "You fired into a cattle drive on a mountain pass," Elena said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was the product of a lifetime of making her voice do things her body wasn't doing. "You could have killed someone." "Could have," Rourke said. "Didn't." "What does Dillard want?" Rourke shifted. He hadn't expected the question to be that direct. "Mr. Dillard has concerns about this network arrangement. He feels it represents a consolidation of resources that's not in the interest of—" "He's worried about the combined volume," she said, "because when we sell together, we set a price floor he has to compete with. If we fail, his buyers set the rate again." She looked at both men. "You fired into a herd with 600 animals and 8 people on a mountain pass in December because Casper Dillard is worried about market competition." Neither man spoke. "Go back and tell him," Elena said, "that this drive is going through. And tell him that if another shot is fired from anywhere near this herd, I will have a complete account of this morning in front of Senator Price and the Calvary County Sheriff before the week is out." She paused. "And tell him that the network is going to keep growing whether he's afraid of it or not. The only question is whether he's part of it or whether he's competing with it. Those are different positions." She turned her horse and rode back toward the herd. Her hand shook on the reins the entire way. She gripped harder and kept moving. Colton was waiting at the head of the herd with 2 hands and an expression that she read as somewhere between furious and something else she didn't have a clean word for. "You rode at them alone," he said. There wasn't time to coordinate." "Elena, they're gone. 2 men with rifles who weren't expecting to actually be confronted." She got her breathing down. "Dillard is behind it. Rourke works for him." Colton's jaw tightened. Casper Dillard. "He's scared of the network. He should be." She straightened in the saddle. "How are the animals?" "Shaken. We haven't lost any yet. The terrain's holding them, but we need to move." "Then let's move." He looked at her for a long moment, something working in his face she couldn't entirely read. "Later," he said. "Later," she agreed. They moved. The second half of the pass was harder than the first. The afternoon weather closed in the way Hicks had warned it might. Not a full storm, but a hard wind off the north face that drove ice crystals horizontally and made visibility drop to 100 yards and then 50, and the cattle slowed and the cold deepened, and Elena rode in that white diminished world and counted animals in her head, and told herself to stop counting and then started again. They lost 11 animals. 2 fell on a section of icy grade that crossed an exposed shelf. Elena heard the sounds and didn't look, because looking wouldn't change it, and she needed to keep the animals behind her moving forward. 6 more succumbed to the cold before they reached the descent, dying on their feet the way cattle die in extreme cold, without drama, just going still. 3 were too weak to make the descent and were left. Colton made the call, which Elena understood was the right call, and still felt like a small wound. 489 animals came down the southern face of Alderman Pass in the blue failing light of a December afternoon and walked into the Brant South pasture where the windbreak stood, and the feed had been arranged, and the hands who'd stayed behind had fires going in the shelter structures. Elena stopped at the edge of the pasture and watched them come in. Hicks pulled up beside her. He was covered in ice and looked approximately as old as the mountain they'd just crossed. Good drive, he said. We lost 11. On that pass in that weather with 2 rifles going off mid-climb? He looked at her sideways. You lost 11. That's a good drive. She was too tired to argue. She didn't think she'd have argued anyway. Colton came to stand beside her. They watched the last animals move through the gate. One of the Caswell brothers was there. The younger one, Marcus, who had ridden out from town when he'd heard what was happening. And he stood with his hat in his hands, watching his cattle come through with the expression of a man who has just understood how close he came to losing everything. He walked over to Elena. He was 28 years old and had spent his life working land that had never quite paid what it should. And he looked at her with an openness that young men sometimes have before the world fully talks them out of it. Mrs. Brant, he said, I'm not sure what to say. Don't say anything tonight, she said. Go make sure your animals are settled. He nodded and went. She watched him go. Silas came the next morning. He'd ridden through the night from town when Decker had sent word, not the full story, just enough. Cattle in trouble, Colton and Mrs. Brant took them through Alderman Pass. Elena heard him arrive before dawn, heard his voice in the yard, heard the controlled quality of it that meant he was holding something in. She was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold and a list of what the drive had cost and what they'd saved. She heard his boots on the porch. She wrapped her hands around the cup. He came in. He looked at her. She looked back. He pulled out a chair and sat down. You took 600 cattle through Alderman Pass, he said. 489 came through. In a December storm. The storm came in on the second half. It wasn't a full storm, more of a hard blow. With 2 men shooting at you from the tree line. They weren't shooting at us. They were shooting to spook the herd. There's a difference, though I admit it wasn't a meaningful difference at the time. He was quiet. He had the look of a man sorting through things in a particular order, and she waited. You didn't tell me, he said. There wasn't time. You could have waited. No, I couldn't. By the time you'd ridden back from town and we'd had the conversation and made the decision, we'd have lost the weather window and the feed timeline would have... She stopped. You would have said no. He was quiet again. I might have, he said, which was, from Silas Brant, the closest thing to admission she'd ever heard. 489 animals alive, she said, versus 600 dead. That's what the decision was. He put both hands flat on the table. He looked at them. He looked up. Dillard, he said. I'll be in his market eventually, whether he likes it or not. He can join or compete. I told his man as much. Casper Dillard doesn't like being told things by women. I know. She met his eyes. He's going to have to get used to it. Something passed across Silas Brant's face, fast, gone before she could read it fully, but she caught the shape of it. Not quite amusement. Closer to recognition, the way you recognize something you weren't expecting to see. He stood up. The Caswell account, he said. They owe us for the drive. Feed, hands, lost animals. We'll settle the numbers. I have the figures already. Of course you do. He moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. The pass. You chose it. Yes. And you rode at 2 armed men alone. There wasn't time. I heard. He looked at her. That was either the most reckless thing I've seen in 22 years of ranching or the most necessary. I haven't decided which. It was both, Elena said. He left. She sat with her cold coffee and the numbers on the table and listened to the house breathe around her. Outside, she could hear the cattle in the south pasture, the low sounds of animals settling, finding their level after 2 days of crisis. The windbreak held. The feed was holding. Colton came in an hour later with his coat still on and dark circles under his eyes and sat across from her. Harlan Cooper rode out this morning, he said, when he heard about the drive. What did he want? To see if his stock made it. Colton paused. They did. All of his made it. Another pause. He stood there for a while looking at them, and then he said, and I'm giving you this exactly. He said, that woman is going to change things around here. Elena looked at her list. We lost 11 animals, she said. Elena. I keep thinking about the 11. Cooper's been ranching for 25 years, Colton said. He doesn't say things like that. About anyone. He was looking at her with that expression again. The one she hadn't found a clean name for yet. That combination of things she'd been filing away for months. You need to sleep. I know. Now. Not after you finish the list. She set down the pencil. She was so tired the table seemed to shift slightly when she looked at it directly. There's a meeting with the Caswell brothers Thursday about the accounting. Thursday's 3 days away. And I need to write to Price's office about Dillard, because if Dillard tries this again, Elena. He put his hand over hers on the table. Not a dramatic gesture, just a hand covering another hand, steady and certain, the way you brace something that's about to fall, not because you think it's weak, but because you understand it's been carrying too much for too long. Sleep. Everything else is still going to be here. She looked at his hand. She looked at him. The 11, she said, and her voice did something it hadn't done through the entire drive. It dropped half a register, went rough at the edge. I keep thinking there was a route that lost fewer, that I missed something. Maybe, he said, or maybe you moved 489 animals through a mountain pass in a December blizzard with 2 men shooting at you, and that's what it was. Sometimes that's all you get. She breathed. The roughness in her voice didn't go away entirely, but she put the pencil down and it stayed down. Okay, she said. Outside, the cattle moved in the south pasture, and the windbreak held, and the sky over the Brandt Ranch was the flat gray of a winter that had done its worst and was not quite finished. And across the county, the neighbors whose herds had not survived the freeze were already beginning to understand the shape of what they'd lost. 3 ranches would not recover. 2 more were calling in their hands and closing up before spring. And in the valley below Alderman Pass, in the frozen silence of the Cooper Ridge where 600 animals had stood 2 days ago, there was nothing now but snow and cold and the particular stillness of a catastrophe that had been moved out of the way before it could land. Moved by 8 people and 1 old trapper and a woman who had arrived in this county with nothing and had, in the space of 1 brutal winter, made herself into the person that the county would not be able to talk about without changing the story of what was possible here. She didn't know that yet. She was asleep before noon, the list unfinished on the table, Colton's coat draped over her shoulders because the kitchen was cold and she hadn't noticed, and he had. The list would be there when she woke up. The work would be there. Everything that still needed doing would be exactly where she'd left it. But for now, the cattle were alive and the pass was behind them and the windbreak held. And that was the thing she'd carried through the mountain, and it was enough. The accounting with the Caswell brothers happened on a Thursday, as planned, and it was not comfortable. Marcus Caswell, the younger one, came in with the openness he'd shown at the pasture gate still intact. His brother Reed was a different matter. Reed was 34 and had been running their operation since their father died 6 years prior, and had the particular hardness of someone who had kept something alive through difficult years by never allowing himself to admit how difficult they were. He sat across the table from Elena with his arms crossed, and the account figures she'd prepared in front of him, and he went through them line by line with the deliberate slowness of a man looking for an error he could use. He didn't find one. The feed cost, he said. You're billing us for the full tonnage. Used on your animals during the drive and in the south pasture since, yes. We didn't authorize that feed. You authorized the grazing agreement. The feed allocation was specified in the agreement as a contingency resource in emergency situations. She had the relevant section bookmarked. She slid the document across. 3rd paragraph. Reed looked at it. He looked at Marcus looked at the table. The hand's wages, Reed said. Prorated for the drive days shared across all participating ranches by head count. She had a separate sheet for this. Your share is 22% of the total, proportional to your animals in the drive. And the lost animals? 11 animals lost in total. 2 were Caswell stock. We're not billing you for those. We're noting them in the account as drive losses, which are shared collectively. You're not paying for your own dead animals. Reed was quiet. He'd come into this room with the intention of finding something wrong, and the not finding of it seemed to be making him more uncomfortable rather than less, which Elena had anticipated. Men like Reed Caswell were not easily reassured by being proven fair. Being proven fair meant they owed something they couldn't argue about, and that was harder than an argument. You saved our herd, Marcus said. He said it quietly, not performing anything, just stating what he believed. We saved our combined herd, Elena said. That's what the network is for. Reed put his pen down. He signed the accounting document without further comment. He stood up, and for a moment he stood there with his hat in his hands and something working behind his eyes that didn't make it to his face. Next time, he said, my cattle get moved before the deadline. I'll see to it personally. I know you will, Elena said. He left. Marcus followed, pausing at the door. The pass, Marcus said. I heard what happened with Dillard's men. Word travels. Around here it does. He looked at her with that directness young men sometimes have before they learn to disguise it. Are you scared of him, Dillard? Elena considered the question. She had enough respect for Marcus Caswell's directness to give it a real answer. I'm careful of him, she said. That's different. Marcus nodded. He put his hat on and went. Casper Dillard did not come himself. He sent his lawyer. The lawyer's name was Fenwick, a soft-spoken man from Austin who wore a good coat and had the careful eyes of someone paid to notice what other people miss. He arrived at the Brant Ranch on a Tuesday in February, 3 weeks after the drive, when the worst of the winter had eased but the cold still had teeth, and he asked to speak with Silas. Silas brought Elena. He did it without an announcement, without discussion. He simply appeared in the doorway of the office where she was working and said, Dillard's lawyer is here. Come. And turned and walked back down the hall, which was the closest thing to an invitation she'd received from him, and she understood to treat it as one. Fenwick sat in the front room with his good coat and his careful eyes, and a leather case on the floor beside his chair. He introduced himself, established his representation of Mr. Casper Dillard, and then opened the leather case and placed a document on the table. Mr. Dillard has significant concerns, Fenwick said, about the nature of the arrangement that has been assembled under the Brant Ranch's coordination. Specifically, he believes the combined buying and selling agreement constitutes an unlawful restraint of trade. Elena had been expecting something like this since the pass. Not these exact words, she hadn't known the legal framework Dillard would use, but the shape of it, a formal claim designed to force them to dissolve the network before it became large enough to be unchallengeable. The agreement is a voluntary cooperative arrangement between independent ranchers, she said. Every participant maintains full ownership of their own operation. There's no price fixing. We negotiate collectively, but each ranch retains the right to sell independently if terms are unsatisfactory. It's the same model as a cattlemen's association. Fenwick's careful eyes moved to her. You are? Elena Brant. She let the name sit. I drafted the network agreements. I see. He made a small adjustment to his posture that told her he'd been briefed on her but had expected her to be more peripheral than she was. Mrs. Brant, the Cattlemen's Association structure is a recognized framework, yes. However, the specific provisions of your agreement regarding joint market access and coordinated volume selling go beyond. What is Mr. Dillard actually proposing? Silas said. He had the patience for legal framing that Elena had, and he was not going to extend it. Fenwick folded his hands. Mr. Dillard is prepared to file a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Commission if the arrangement continues in its current form. Alternatively, he would welcome a conversation about restructuring. Restructuring, Elena said. The inclusion of Mr. Dillard's operation in the network, on terms commensurate with his scale, would address his competitive concerns and render the complaint unnecessary. The room was quiet. Elena looked at the document on the table. She looked at Silas. His face was doing nothing she could read, which she'd come to understand meant he was thinking rather than reacting. She turned back to Fenwick. Tell Mr. Dillard that his operation is welcome to apply for participation in the network, she said. The same terms apply to everyone. signed grazing agreements, participation in the breeding pool, compliance with the coordinated selling schedule. There's no special tier for scale. If his operation is as large as it is, he'll benefit proportionally more from collective market access anyway. He would expect, Fenwick said carefully, to have a voice in the network's governance commensurate with his size. Governance is currently handled by the participating ranches collectively. One ranch, one voice. She held his gaze. Mr. Dillard gets one voice, same as the Caswell brothers, same as the Brants. Fenwick was quiet for a moment. He won't accept that. Then he files his complaint, Elena said, and I retain a lawyer and we respond to it. And while that's happening, the network continues to operate and grow. And by the time anything is resolved through official channels, we'll be large enough that a territorial land commission is going to look very carefully at whether interfering with an established cooperative of 17 ranches is good policy. She paused. Which it won't be. Fenwick looked at Silas. Silas looked at the window. She's speaking for this ranch, Silas said, and the network. Fenwick picked up the document. He put it back in the leather case. He stood, thanked them for their time with the professional warmth of a man who is paid to be pleasant in difficult circumstances, and left. The front room was quiet. 17, Silas said. We have 11 currently, Elena said. But by the time any complaint works its way through official channels, we'll have 17. I've had conversations with 6 more operations in the past month. She paused. I wanted to tell you in better conditions, but this seemed like the right moment. He looked at her. You've been negotiating new participants without preliminary conversations. Nothing signed. I wouldn't finalize anything without your knowledge. But you would tell me when it was convenient. I would tell you when it was ready. She held his gaze. Those aren't the same thing, and you've done the same to me. A pause, long enough to mean something. 17, he said again, and this time there was something different in his voice. Not capitulation, not approval exactly, but the sound of a man revising a number he'd been carrying and finding the revision larger than he'd anticipated. At least, Elena said. Spring arrived with the suddenness of a debt being paid, all at once and slightly more than expected. The grass came back faster than anyone had predicted. The pedernales rose to a respectable level, and the cattle that had come through the winter were in good enough condition to begin the recovery the network needed. It was also the season in which the full weight of what the bad winter had cost the county became visible. 3 operations had folded entirely, their land already being absorbed by larger holdings or left to sit. The Hatch Ranch, which Mrs. Dora Hatch had mentioned at the social that first autumn with such settled authority, had lost their entire upper herd and was in discussions about selling. The Oaks family, who had been early network participants, had survived with 30% of their cattle. Enough to rebuild from, but only barely, and only because the network's coordinated feed reserves had been available to them. It was the Oaks situation that changed something for Elena, though it took her a while to understand what had changed. Thomas Oaks was 52, a slow-spoken, deliberate man who had homesteaded his land 20 years ago with his wife, and had built something modest and solid and genuinely his own. He came to the Brant Ranch in March to settle the winter account, his share of the emergency costs, and he sat at the kitchen table with the figures Elena had prepared, and he went through them with the same care he brought to everything. And when he was done, he folded his hands and looked at her. I can pay this, he said. It'll take me through summer to do it, but I can. I know you can, she said. But if we'd done this the way I was doing things before, he stopped. I'd be selling the land right now, both parcels. I'd be done. He said it with the flatness of someone stating a fact they have accepted rather than one they're still fighting. My grandfather homesteaded in Missouri. My father moved us to Texas. I was going to leave that land to my son. He put his hands on the table. You made that possible. I want you to know I understand that. She didn't know what to say immediately, which was unusual for her. She had become comfortable with most of the social transactions that the network required. The negotiating, the accounting, the careful management of competing interests, but genuine gratitude, offered plainly and without expectation, was harder to receive than any argument. The network made it possible, she said finally. That's what it's for. The network didn't ride up Alderman Pass, he said. She looked at her hands. Mr. Oaks, she said, your winter account, the portion that covers the emergency feed, I'd like to restructure it. Instead of payment over the summer, what if we convert it to an extended share in the breeding pool? Your first-generation calves from the improved stock would offset the account within 2 seasons, and you'd have a stronger foundation going into next year. He looked at her. That's a better arrangement for me than for you. It's a better arrangement for the network, she said. A Oaks ranch that's rebuilding from strength is a more reliable participant than one that's paying off debt through summer. He was quiet. He looked at the table and then at the window and then back at her. My wife wants to have you both to dinner, he said. You and Colton, when things settle a bit. We'd like that. She said. He stopped, seemed to decide something. She said, you're the kind of woman who comes along maybe once in a generation in a place. She wanted me to tell you that. Elena felt something move in her chest that she didn't entirely have a name for. Not pride, it wasn't quite pride. Closer to the feeling of being seen by someone whose seeing you'd needed without knowing it. Thank your wife for me, she said. The thing with Colton shifted in the spring, and neither of them announced it or discussed it or marked it in any way that could be clearly identified afterward. It happened in the ordinary movement of days. In the mornings when they went over the network figures together, and he started offering observations that were not just agreement, but actual separate perspective. In the evenings when the lamp was low and they talked about the operations with the easy shorthand of two people who have been working the same problem long enough to have developed a shared language for it. In the small things, the way he started positioning himself beside her rather than across from her when they spoke to ranch hands about the operation, the way she stopped framing proposals as things she was going to do and started framing them as things they were going to do. And he did the same, and neither of them commented on the change because commenting would have required acknowledging what the change meant. It was Decker who brought it to a head, in the sideways manner of men who have been watching something develop for months and have finally run out of patience with their own silence. He came to Colton on a Thursday evening in April, when Elena was across the county at the Cooper Ranch discussing the summer rotation schedule, and he said what he'd been working toward saying for months. You know what you have there, Decker said. They were in the barn, the way they always were when Decker had something he actually meant. Colton was checking the mare's leg, the same mare, finally fully recovered, moving well on that foreleg. He kept his hands on the animal. What do I have? He said. Not a question. A partner, Decker said. A real one. Not a ledger woman, not a smart wife who handles the books. A partner. He paused. I've been at this ranch since before you were old enough to sit a horse. I've watched your father run this operation for 22 years, and I'm telling you what I see. And what do you see? I see a man who's been standing half a step behind something he didn't ask for and has spent the past 9 months deciding whether he's grateful or resentful, and hasn't figured out that those two things stopped being relevant about 3 months ago. Decker picked up a brush and started working on a nearby horse, his back half to Colton. She rode into rifle fire on a mountain to save this ranch's cattle. She sat across from your father and didn't flinch once. She built a thing in less than a year that 20 years of Silas Brandt couldn't build. He paused. And she did it to survive, and then she did it because she's the kind of person who can't see a problem without needing to solve it. But she did it here, on this land, for this name. He looked at Colton over his shoulder. You going to waste that? Colton was quiet for a long time. No, he said. Good. Decker went back to brushing, then stopped standing half a step behind. Elena came home from the Cooper Ranch at dusk to find the kitchen lamp already lit and a meal on the table. Not an elaborate meal, nothing approaching anything one would describe as cooked with care and intention, but food that had been prepared by someone who didn't usually prepare it, and that was its own language. She stopped in the doorway. Colton was at the table with the spring rotation maps spread out and a pencil in his hand, and he looked up when she came in. I marked the adjustments you mentioned for the Cooper North section, he said. She came in, took off her coat, sat across from him. She looked at the maps. The adjustments were right. Better than she'd have drawn them, actually, because he knew the terrain of the Cooper North section in a way she'd never physically walked it. This is better, she said, pointing. The draw runs east, not west, changes the drainage in spring. I didn't know that. You didn't walk it. He looked at her. You should walk it. I know what you've been. I'm saying there's things I know that you don't, same as the reverse. He said it without defensiveness or point-making, just as a fact. We'd do better if we stopped moving around each other. She looked at him. Yes, she said. We would. He picked up the pencil. She pulled the nearest map toward her. They worked for an hour in the quiet kitchen, the lamp between them, and outside the spring night was full of sounds. Cattle, wind, the pedernales running at a decent level for the first time in a year. The breaking point with Silas came in May, and it was a long time arriving. Senator Price sent a letter proposing an expansion of the northern contracts, twice the volume, which meant twice the income, but also required a capital investment in additional breeding stock that the Brant Ranch couldn't carry alone. Elena's proposal was to finance it through a shared network investment, each participating ranch contributing proportionally, each receiving a proportional share of the expanded contract income. Silas wanted to finance it through a private loan and keep the contract exclusively Brant. The argument lasted 3 days. It was not one continuous argument. It had the structure of a siege, breaking off and resuming, each side returning to the table with slightly adjusted positions, but neither moving the essential ground. The essential ground on Silas's side was 22 years of building something that bore his name and his decisions and his judgment, and the absolute unwillingness to dilute that into a collective. The essential ground on Elena's side was arithmetic. The loan at current rates will cost us $4,000 over 3 years, she said, on the third day in the office, with both of them standing because neither had sat down. The network investment costs nothing in interest, spreads the risk, and maintains the relationships we've spent a year building. If one bad season hits during the loan period, we're carrying debt we can't service. If the same season hits with the network financing, the risk is distributed. The network doesn't own this ranch, Silas said. No, but this ranch doesn't carry a loan it can't cover. I've carried debt before. Not at this scale. Not with this much already in motion. She looked at him squarely. He sat down behind his desk, which had always been the position of authority in this room, and he looked at the two people standing before him. His son and the woman his son had been handed like a transaction 9 months ago. And he did the thing that cost him more than the mountain, or the lawyer, or the 3 days of argument. He picked up his pen. Bring me the network financing proposal, he said. Elena had it ready. She'd had it ready for 2 days. She put it on the desk without comment. The public acknowledgement came at the Spring Cattlemen's meeting in Calvary, which was the first such meeting that Elena attended as something other than an addendum to someone else's presence. There were 43 ranchers in the room, the highest attendance anyone could remember, drawn partly by curiosity about the network, and partly by the simple fact that the landscape of the county had changed enough over the winter that people who'd been content to stay separate were reconsidering what separate cost them. Silas spoke first, as the senior operator, and he laid out the winter survival numbers and the spring outlook and the expansion of the price contracts. He did it clearly and without embellishment, which was his natural mode, and the room listened with the particular attention of people who are hearing information that affects their own circumstances. Then he said, "The network coordination has been managed by Elena Brant. She'll speak to the structure and the participation terms." He said it simply. No elaboration. But in that room, among 43 ranchers who had spent the past year watching the Brant operation from the outside and had formed opinions about who was really driving what, the simplicity of it was its own statement. Elena stood up. She was 25 years old, 11 months removed from sitting on a fence rail waiting to be handed over like a deed, and she stood in front of 43 ranchers in a county that had not known she existed the previous spring, and she talked about the network. She talked about how it worked, what it cost, what it required from participants, and what it returned. She talked about the winter, not with drama, but with numbers. How many animals survived in network ranches versus non-network operations? What the differential meant in dollar terms? What it would mean over a 5-year horizon if the cooperative structure continued to expand? She answered questions directly, didn't soften hard answers, and didn't dress up the parts that had been genuinely difficult. When she was done, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Harlan Cooper, who had been sitting in the third row with his arms crossed and his face doing nothing readable, unfolded his arms. "I want to add something," he said, and everyone looked at him because Harlan Cooper was not a man who volunteered additions. This woman rode 600 cattle through Alderman Pass in a December blizzard with men firing rifles from the trees. He paused. "She did it because my cattle were on that ridge, and so were Caswell cattle and Brant cattle, and leaving them there wasn't an option she was willing to accept. Another pause. I've been ranching in this county for 25 years. I've never seen anyone do that, man or woman. He looked at Elena. I just wanted to say it in a room where everyone could hear it. The room was not entirely quiet after that. It was the sound of 43 people processing the realignment of something they'd understood in a particular way and were now understanding differently. Colton, sitting in the second row, looked at his wife standing at the front of the room, composed, a little tired around the eyes, in the way she'd been since December, not performing anything, not asking for anything, and felt something that had been building since a Tuesday evening in early winter when she'd said, "I can't do this part without you," and he had understood for the first time that what she was building was real. He thought about what Decker had said. You going to waste that? He looked at Elena at the front of the room, and he thought, no, not a chance. After the meeting, in the yard outside the hall, where ranchers stood in clusters and the evening air was warm enough to suggest summer was coming, Mrs. Dora Hatch found Elena. Dora Hatch, whose ranch had not survived the winter, who had arrived at this meeting in circumstances that were in every material way worse than they'd been the previous autumn, stood in front of Elena with an expression that cost her something to hold. I owe you an apology, she said. You don't, Elena said. I do. Dora Hatch was not a woman who softened things. I was unkind to you from the beginning, and I was wrong. She paused. I'd like to ask about participation terms for the Hatch Ranch, if there's still something to participate with. Come by Thursday, Elena said. We'll look at the numbers together. Dora Hatch nodded once and walked away, and she was not going to cry in a public yard about it, and she did not, but she walked with the particular straightness of someone holding themselves together by the work of it. Elena watched her go. Colton appeared at her shoulder. How many applications tonight? He said. 7, maybe 8. She looked at the yard, the clusters, the conversations, the general reorientation happening in real time. It's going to be a busy summer. Are you ready for a busy summer? She looked at him sideways. He was looking at her with that expression she'd finally found a name for, somewhere between the December drive and the spring meeting, in the ordinary accumulation of shared mornings and late lamp evenings, and arguments with his father and Decker's observations, and Thomas Oakes saying once in a generation in a way she'd carried with her since. The expression was, you are exactly who I thought you were, and I mean that differently now than I would have 12 months ago. Yes, she said. Are you? I think so. He paused. I think we are. She looked back at the yard, at the 43 ranchers and the 7 or 8 conversations already heading toward Thursday, at the county that had looked one way in September and looked different now and would look different again by autumn. We are, she agreed. The evening settled around them, warm and full of the sound of people figuring out what came next, and the Brant Ranch stood at the center of it the way solid things stand, not perfectly, not without cost, but real and growing, and pointed in a direction it hadn't been pointed before. There was still so much to build. There always would be. But they were building it together now, and that was a different thing entirely. The busy summer Elena had predicted turned out to be the understatement of the decade. By July, the network had 23 participating ranches. By September, 31. The applications came in with the particular momentum of something that has crossed the threshold from experiment to established fact. Ranchers who had watched from a careful distance through the winter and spring, who had done their own arithmetic on what survival looked like inside the network versus outside it, who had arrived at the same conclusion Thomas Oakes had arrived at and were no longer willing to bet against it. Elena processed every application herself. She had tried, twice, to delegate the initial review to Colton or to the young man they'd hired as a network administrator, a meticulous 26-year-old named Pruitt who was good with figures and better with filing. But she kept coming back to the table with corrections and questions. And eventually she accepted that the intake process was one she needed to own because the early conversation with a new participant set the terms of everything that followed, and she couldn't afford to get those terms wrong. Colton watched her work through August with the particular attention of someone who has learned to read the difference between productive intensity and the kind that eventually breaks something. You slept 4 hours last night, he said one morning, not accusatory, just stating it. 5, she said without looking up. Pruitt counted the Meridian paperwork as done. You pulled it back. The grazing allocation for their north section was wrong. They'd calculated on last year's head count, not this year's. Pruitt would have caught it. He would have caught it in October when the rotation didn't match. She looked up. That's too late. He sat down across from her. Elena, we have 31 ranches. You cannot personally verify every figure for 31 ranches. Not forever, she said. But right now, while the foundation is being set, yes, I have to. Because if the foundation is wrong, everything built on it is wrong, and I'd rather lose sleep now than lose operations later. He looked at her. She looked back. They had developed, over the past year, the particular communication efficiency of two people who have argued the same underlying argument enough times to know where it ends up, and they both knew where this one ended up. She was right about the foundation, and he was right about the sleep, and neither of those things resolved the other. 2 more months, she said. By October, the intake process will be standardized enough that Pruitt can run it reliably. I'll know because I'll have done it enough times to write the exceptions into the protocol. 2 months, he said. 2 months. He picked up the Meridian paperwork. Tell me what was wrong with the north section figure and I'll fix it, she told him. He fixed it. They worked through the morning in the shared shorthand they'd developed, and outside the summer pressed down on everything with its usual indifference, and the network grew another day older and another day more real. Casper Dillard came in September. Not his lawyer this time. Dillard himself, a large man in his mid-50s, the kind of physical presence that had probably gotten him a great deal of what he wanted in life before he'd developed the financial weight to get the rest. He drove out to the Brant Ranch on a Tuesday and asked to speak with Elena directly, which Silas relayed to her with an expression she couldn't read cleanly. He asked for you, Silas said. By name. I heard. I'll be in the room. I know. She paused. You don't have to be. He was quiet for a moment. I'll be in the room, he said again, and she understood this was not about distrust of her competence, but something else. Something that had been shifting in him since the spring meeting, since the network financing argument, since the slow accumulation of a year in which this woman he had acquired like a property had turned into the most significant business mind his operation had encountered. He would be in the room because he wanted to be, because whatever was happening had become something he was part of rather than something he was watching. All right, she said. Dillard sat across from her in the front room with his hat on his knee and the easy posture of a man who has spent decades occupying rooms as if he owned them. He looked at Elena with the frank assessment of someone who had done extensive research and was now comparing the research to the reality. You're younger than I expected, he said. You're larger, she said. We've both made our assessments. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. I want to talk about Rourke, he said. I thought you might. What happened on that pass was not my instruction. Rourke made a decision about approach that went beyond what I'd authorized. Elena looked at him steadily. What had you authorized? A pause. Reconnaissance. Understanding the route. And the rifles? Were not part of my instruction. He held her gaze. I'm not asking you to accept that as an apology. I'm telling you it's accurate. She considered this. She had thought about Dillard's culpability many times since December, and she had arrived at a position that was neither forgiveness nor ongoing hostility, but something more pragmatic. She didn't know exactly where the line was between what he'd authorized and what Rourke had decided, and she probably never would, and the question of what to do about it had to be answered based on present reality rather than unresolvable past. Rourke no longer works for you, she said. She had heard this through the county's information channels, which were extensive. No. Then we can talk about what you actually came here to discuss. Dillard put his hat on the table. It was a deliberate gesture, setting something down. I have 4,000 head, he said. Best breeding stock in the territory. 20 years of selection, and I'll put my lines against anyone's. I know your stock, Elena said. Your bull lines are exceptional. Your cow selection is adequate. He blinked. It was the blink of a man who has been told something accurate that he was expecting to be flattering and wasn't. The network, he said. I want in. You know the terms. 1 ranch, 1 voice. You told Fenwick. He paused. I understand the structure. I'm not asking for a different structure. I'm asking if the offer still stands. Elena looked at him. She looked at Silas, who was at the window saying nothing. She thought about the pass and the rifles and the morning she'd ridden into the tree line alone, her hands shaking on the reins the whole way back. She thought about 4,000 head of cattle and the best bull lines in the territory, and what that would mean for the breeding pool. "The offer stands," she said, "on the same terms as everyone else. And the winter account, the emergency provisions, prorated by head count, same as every other participant. My operation is 10 times the size of, and you'll benefit 10 times as much from the combined market access." She held his gaze. "The terms are the terms, Mr. Dillard. That's not a negotiating position." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his hat. "Send me the agreement," he said. "I'll have it back to you by Friday." He stood. He looked at Silas. Something passed between the two older men. Not warmth, the history between them was too complicated for warmth, but the acknowledgement of men who have been rivals for 2 decades and are now being asked to occupy the same structure, and who find, to their own mild surprise, that the structure is large enough. Dillard left. The front room was quiet. "Friday," Silas said. "He'll send it Wednesday," Elena said. "He doesn't want to look eager." Silas made a sound that was, unmistakably, a laugh. It was the second time she'd heard him laugh in 14 months of living under the same roof, and it was still startling, like hearing a sound you didn't know a piece of furniture could make. "Wednesday," he said, and walked out. It came back Wednesday, signed. The thing with Silas resolved itself slowly and without ceremony, the way most real things resolve, not in a single moment, but in the gradual accumulation of smaller ones. It was a Tuesday in October when he came to find her in the office that had been his exclusively for 22 years and had, by incremental negotiation and the simple pressure of necessity, become the room where they both worked. He came in and sat down across from her, which he did regularly now, and he put a piece of paper on the desk. She looked at it. It was the network charter, the foundational document she'd drafted in the spring and which had been signed by the 31 participating ranches. At the top, where the originating operation was listed, Silas had made a notation in his handwriting. The notation read, "Brandt Ranch. Silas Brandt and Elena Brandt, equal partners in operation and network governance." She looked at the paper. She looked at him. "The original lists only the Brandt Ranch," she said. "I'm aware of what the original lists." He was looking at the desk rather than at her. "It should have listed both from the beginning. I'm correcting it." She was quiet. "This doesn't change the governance structure for the other ranches," he said. "They've always understood that you were—" He paused, chose the word carefully. "Central. This makes it formal." She thought about the fence rail, the office with the broken coffee cups on the floor, the ledgers arriving in her room carried by a boy who wouldn't meet her eyes, the social gathering where the conversation had arranged itself around her absence, Decker's arms crossed in the yard, the mountain, the rifles, the 11 animals she still counted sometimes in the dark. She thought about what it cost to build something in a place that didn't make room for you, and how the building changes the place, and whether that was always how it worked or whether she had just gotten lucky in the specific way you get lucky when you refuse to accept the alternative. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He stood up. He was at the door when she said, "Silas." He turned. "You built something real here," she said. 22 years. It mattered. Whatever comes next is built on that." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had never seen on him before and couldn't fully name. Something between the pride of a man whose work has been acknowledged and the humility of one who has recently understood that acknowledgement is not the same as completion. Something tired and something honest. "Don't make me sentimental," he said. "I have a reputation." He walked out, and she heard him in the hall, and the house settled around her, and outside the October sky was the deep clear blue that comes after the heat has finally relented, and she sat in the office that had both their names on the charter and thought about what next year would look like, and the year after that. What it looked like, in the years that followed, was this. The breeding pool produced its first generation of improved cattle in the spring after Dillard joined, and the results were better than Elena's projections. Not by a dramatic margin, but by a consistent one, which over time was more valuable than drama. Better birth weight, better survival rate, better market weight. The numbers that had been theoretical became actual, and actual numbers, held in a ledger anyone could read, were more convincing than any argument. The combined selling arrangement grew to cover 60% of the cattle sold in the territory within 4 years. Buyers who had been setting their own terms for a decade had to negotiate properly for the first time, and the rates moved toward actual market value with the grinding inevitability of arithmetic. Harmon and Cade's regional agent, Garrett, was still in the picture. He'd been fair once Elena had given him a reason to be fair, and she respected consistency even in a buyer. The Caswell brothers rebuilt. Thomas Oakes added a second parcel. Harlan Cooper expanded his ridge operation in a way he hadn't thought financially viable 3 years earlier and was now the second largest breeding contributor in the pool. Dora Hatch's ranch recovered more slowly than the others. There were years when it was genuinely uncertain, but it recovered, and Dora Hatch arrived at every network meeting with the particular ferocity of a woman who has been given a second chance and intends to be worthy of it. Decker retired in the 3rd year, which he announced by simply telling Colton one morning that his knees were done and he was going to his sister's place in New Mexico. He shook Colton's hand and he turned to Elena and he looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "You were right about the East Pasture rotation," which was the closest he had to an apology and was, she understood, genuinely meant. "You were right about smart people being sure," she said. "I've tried to hold on to that." He nodded once and got on his horse and rode away, and she watched him go with the complicated feeling of someone who has been resisted and respected by the same person for 3 years and is now watching that person leave a situation they could no longer hold against her. Colton became, over those years, someone she had not anticipated when she'd sat on the fence rail and looked at the man crossing the yard toward her. He was not transformed. She had long since stopped believing that people transformed, understanding instead that they revealed, that the people they became were always contained in the people they were, waiting for conditions that allowed the reveal. The Colton who had taken his hat off when he came to give her bad news, who had spent an entire dinner keeping his father from noticing that she was reading the fine print on a contract under the table, who had said, "I think I could hold the line if you're the one standing there." That Colton had always been there. He'd just spent 29 years in a house that didn't have much use for him. He was good at things she wasn't, which was the real foundation of it. He knew terrain the way she knew ledgers. He could read a sick animal 3 days before the symptoms were obvious, which had saved them more than once. He had a patience with people who were frightened or angry that she didn't naturally have. She tended to address the problem rather than the person, and he had learned to pull her back to the person when it mattered, and she had learned to let him. They argued, regularly and specifically and sometimes at length, about strategy, about timing, about when to push and when to wait, about the particular disagreement that recurred every spring about how aggressively to expand the network. She thought bigger. He thought steadier. They were both right, depending on the season, and they had learned to know which season it was. He named her partner publicly the first time at the spring cattlemen's meeting in their 2nd year, introducing her as his equal in the operations management to a room that had, by that point, already understood this to be true, but had not heard it stated. The stating of it mattered. Not to Elena's sense of herself. She'd known what she was doing since the first ledger. But to the room, to the county, to the record of how things stood. She had not asked him to do it. He had done it because it was accurate. The last real fight with the old way of things came in the 4th year, from a direction she hadn't expected. Senator Price's successor, Price had retired, his health declining, his successor, a younger man named Caldwell with sharper political instincts and a different notion of where the territory was headed, proposed a land consolidation act that would have restructured grazing rights across the county in a way that favored large single-owner operations over cooperative networks. The language was careful, and the stated intention was efficiency, but Elena read it 3 times and understood what it would do. It would make the network structure legally disadvantageous, tilting the regulatory terrain toward operations like Dillard's used to be. Large, singular, uncollaborative. She went to Austin. She went with figures and with the signed participation agreements of 38 ranches and with the specific economic data of what the network had produced for the county over 4 years. Survival rates, employment numbers, market access improvements, tax contribution figures. She did not go with emotion or with the story of a mountain pass or with anything that could be dismissed as personal. She sat before Caldwell's legislative committee for 2 hours, and she made the case in the language that legislative committees actually hear: numbers, outcomes, constituency impact. Caldwell was a careful politician, which meant he listened to things that had votes behind them. 38 ranches, he said at one point. 38 at present, Elena said, with a waiting list of 12 additional operations seeking participation. He looked at his colleagues on the committee. They looked at him. The Consolidation Act passed in a modified form that explicitly protected cooperative network structures from the new grazing regulations. It was not everything she'd wanted. The modification process had required compromises on the eastern grazing corridor that she still thought were wrong. But it was sufficient. The network was protected. She came home on a Friday evening to find Colton in the south pasture checking the fall herd condition, which was what he did when he was waiting for something without wanting to look like he was waiting. "Well," he said. "The network provisions stand." He exhaled. Not dramatically, just the specific release of breath that means a held thing has been let go. How bad were the compromises? Eastern corridor is going to be more restricted than I wanted. We'll need to adjust the meridian rotation. I'll look at the terrain options next week. I know you will. She stopped beside him and looked at the herd. The fall cattle fat and settled. The breeding program's results visible in the consistency of the animals. The particular quality that comes from careful selection maintained over years. "It looks good." "It looks good," he agreed. They stood there in the fall evening, not performing anything for anyone, just two people looking at the thing they'd built and seeing it clearly. Not perfectly, not without the awareness of everything it had cost and everything still unfinished, but clearly. Which is, in the end, the only honest way to look at anything you've made. Silas died in the 5th year, in early winter, quickly and without much drama, which was consistent with how he'd lived. He had a bad week, and then a worse one, and then he was gone. And the ranch and the network and everything that had been built on and around and through his original foundation continued without him, which was exactly what he would have wanted and probably would not have admitted to wanting. Elena sat in the office the day after the funeral, and she thought about a man who had broken coffee cups on a plank floor to emphasize a point, who had acquired a wife for his son like a business decision, who had listened to her numbers with the expression of someone who had already decided not to see them, and then, incrementally, against his own nature, had started to see them, who had put her name on the charter, who had said, "Don't make me sentimental," and walked away, and who had, in the years between that moment and his death, never once treated her as anything other than what she was. She thought about the things that can't be resolved cleanly, the fact that he had been a difficult man who had done a harmful thing in bringing her here under false terms, and also a man who had, in the end, adjusted to what she was with more grace than most men in his position would have managed. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and she had made her peace with holding them together. She picked up her pencil. There was work to do. There was always work to do. Colton came to find her an hour later. He sat across from her without saying anything for a moment, which was its own kind of presence. "How are you?" she said. "I don't know yet," he said. "I think it takes a while." "It does." He looked at the desk, the papers, the ledgers, the draft of the next network expansion proposal that she'd been working on before the bad week had started, and that sat waiting with the patience of things that have no urgency of their own. "He was proud of what we built," he said. He didn't say it, but he was. "I know," she said. "I could tell." "How?" She thought about it. "He stopped arguing against it," she said. "For your father, that was the same as pride." Colton made the sound that might have been a laugh, the one she'd been cataloging since the first autumn, that had grown less ambiguous over the years. It was a laugh. She'd decided that a long time ago. But years later, enough years that the specific sequence of seasons had blurred at the edges without the essentials blurring. A young woman arrived at the Brant Ranch with a letter in her hand. She was 22 and she had some education and some ability and no money and a letter of application that was genuine rather than pretextual, and she was looking for work as a bookkeeper. She had heard that the Brant Network Operations Office needed someone for the accounts. Elena was 41 by then, and she received the young woman in the front room where Casper Dillard had once sat with his hat on his knee, and she read the letter of application, and she looked at the young woman across the table. She looked at the directness in how the young woman held herself still and waited. "Tell me what you know about the network," Elena said. The young woman told her, thoroughly, specifically, with an attention to the structural details that went beyond what most people understood from the outside. Why do you want this position? Elena said. The young woman looked at her. Because I'm good with numbers, she said, and I have ideas about the Eastern Corridor rotation that I think are better than the current approach. And I'd rather be somewhere where having ideas about the Eastern Corridor rotation is an asset rather than a problem. Elena looked at her for a long moment. She thought about a fence rail and a man crossing a yard with bad news, and the first ledger, and 3 in the morning, and 4 sheets of paper, and a mountain in December. And the first time Silas Brandt had sat down at a table she'd invited him to, and the spring meeting, and Harlan Cooper unfolding his arms, and Thomas Oakes and Dora Hatch, and the particular sound of 38 signed agreements being placed before a legislative committee. She thought about what it takes, and what it costs, and what it builds, and whether the building is worth the cost. And she knew the answer to that, the way she knew the answer to any question she'd spent long enough with. Yes, and not simply, and yes. Tell me about the Eastern Corridor idea, she said. The young woman told her. Elena listened. Completely. The way she listened to things she intended to use. Outside, the Brandt banner moved in the wind above the largest cattle operation in the territory, and the network it had anchored ran through 38 operations across 4 counties, and the land that had once been dry and failing was productive and alive, and none of it had been given or inherited or arranged by anyone except the people who had built it from what they had, which was sometimes not much and was always enough. Not because it was easy, because they hadn't stopped. That is the only lesson that has ever mattered. Not that the right people win, or that effort guarantees outcome, or that the world arranges itself fairly for those who deserve it. It doesn't. It didn't for Elena, who arrived in a place that had no use for her and made herself indispensable through the sheer refusal to accept the terms she'd been handed. What mattered was the refusal. The sitting down at 3 in the morning with a blank piece of paper and drawing lines between things that no one else had thought to connect. The writing toward the rifles instead of away. The putting of both names on the charter, late, imperfect, but there. The world doesn't give you your place in it. You build it, or you don't. And the building is hard, and the building is worth it, and the building is the point. Elena Brandt knew that. She had known it since a fence rail in a dry autumn, with a man crossing a yard toward her with his hat in his hand and bad news on his face, and she had decided, not then, but in the next breath, and the one after that, and every day for every year after, that she was going to build something anyway. She did. The summer after the spring cattlemen's meeting was the hardest working season Elena had known, and she had known some hard ones. The 7 applications from the meeting yard became 11 within a week, as word traveled through the county with the speed that only genuinely useful information travels. People who had spent the winter watching 3 operations fold and 2 more come within a season of folding had done their arithmetic with the particular focus that near disaster produces, and the arithmetic kept coming out the same way. The ranches inside the network had survived, and the ranches outside it mostly hadn't, and that was not a complicated lesson. Pruitt handled the initial paperwork with the meticulous efficiency that made him valuable, but Elena sat across from every new applicant herself, at least once, because the intake conversation was the one that set the terms of everything after. She needed to understand not just the numbers of each operation, headcount, land acreage, water access, debt position, but the person running it, whether they understood what they were joining or whether they thought they were joining a buying club, whether they had the disposition to share information honestly because the network ran on transparent accounting and an operation that fudged its figures created problems that rippled outward through the whole structure. Most people, she had found, were honest when the system around them made honesty the easier choice. The network made it the easier choice. That was part of the design. Marcus Caswell brought 2 neighboring outfits in with him, ranchers he'd known for years who trusted his judgment, which was the network producing its own growth in the way healthy things do. Harlan Cooper sent a letter recommending a family called the Lunds, who ran a solid small operation north of the ridge, and Elena processed the Lund application with the particular attention she gave to Cooper's recommendations, because Cooper did not recommend carelessly. By August, she had 23 participating ranches. By September, 31. By the time the leaves came off the cottonwoods along the Pedernales, and the air took on the first real edge of the coming winter, Elena sat in the office one evening with the current participant list in front of her, and looked at what a year of work had produced, and felt something she didn't often let herself feel during the working of it. The specific satisfaction of a thing that had been theoretical and had become actual. Colton came in and found her sitting still, which was unusual enough that he stopped in the doorway. "You're not working," he said. "I'm looking at the list." He came in and sat across from her and looked at it too. 31 names, 31 operations that had not existed in any connected form 14 months ago. "Reed Caswell told me something yesterday," Colton said. "What?" "He said he was wrong about you." He paused. "He didn't say it to me exactly. He was talking to Harlan Cooper, and I was close enough to hear. He said, I came into that first meeting looking for something wrong with the numbers, and there wasn't anything wrong with the numbers, and I've been thinking about that ever since." Elena looked at the list. "He's been a good participant." "That's not the point." "I know it's not the point." He looked at her sideways. "You're allowed to let it matter." "It matters," she said. "I just don't know what to do with it when it does." He didn't answer that because it wasn't really a question that wanted an answer. It was one of the things she said out loud occasionally that were truer than most of what people said out loud, and he had learned to receive them as such rather than trying to resolve them. Outside, the evening settled over the county, and the network held its 31 ranches in the quiet way that solid structures hold things. Without drama, without announcement, just present and load-bearing. Casper Dillard came in September, as he had the previous year, but this time the conversation was different in every way that mattered. He came without Fenwick, without the leather case, without the posture of a man who has decided in advance what the outcome will be. He drove out to the Brant Ranch on a Tuesday, and he sat in the front room and he looked at Elena across the table with the straightforward assessment of a man who has spent 12 months reconsidering a position and has arrived somewhere he didn't entirely expect. "I want to talk about the breeding pool," he said. "All right." "My bull lines. You said last year they were exceptional." "They are." "And you said my cow selection was adequate." He said it without resentment, just accuracy. "I've been thinking about that word. Adequate." "It was accurate." "I know it was accurate. That's why I've been thinking about it." He put his hands on the table. They were large, capable hands, the hands of a man who had worked cattle himself before the scale of his operation made that impractical. "I want to know what you see in the cow selection that I'm not seeing." Elena looked at him. This was not the conversation she had prepared for. She had been ready for another version of the Fenwick discussion, better tempered but essentially the same in structure. This was different. This was a man with 40 years of cattle experience asking a woman half his age to tell him something he'd missed, and asking it plainly. "Your cow selection optimizes for current market weight," she said. "You're selecting the heaviest animals at sale weight, which makes sense for short-term yield, but you're losing maternal traits in the process. Mothering instinct, milk production, calf survival rate. Your first-year calf mortality is running about 4% above what your bull lines would predict if the cows were matched to them properly." He was quiet. "I ran the numbers from your last 3 years of records," she said, "the ones you submitted with the application. You analyzed my records. I analyze every applicant's records. That's the intake process. And you found a 4% mortality gap. 4.2 to be specific. Over 3 years in your herd size, that's a significant number of animals." He sat with that for a moment. The quiet of a man not performing consideration, but actually doing it. "What would you do?" he said. "If it were your operation." She told him. She told him specifically which traits to prioritize in the next selection cycle, how to phase the adjustment without disrupting current production, which bloodlines in the existing breeding pool would complement his bull lines most effectively if the cow selection shifted toward maternal traits. It took 20 minutes, and she drew 2 small diagrams on a piece of paper to illustrate the selection logic. He asked 3 questions. They were good questions, the kind that come from someone who understands enough to know exactly which assumptions to probe. When she was done, he looked at the diagrams. "Send me the network agreement," he said. "Same terms as everyone else." "I'll have Pruitt send it this afternoon." He stood up. He picked up his hat. He paused. "The pass," he said. "What Rourke did. I want you to know that it cost me something when I understood what had actually happened up there." He said it with the difficulty of a man delivering information he's owed rather than one seeking absolution. "I can't undo it. I'm saying it cost me something." "I heard you," Elena said. He nodded once and left, and she sat in the front room for a moment after his boots had crossed the porch and his horse had moved away from the rail. Silas appeared in the doorway. "He'll be the largest participant," Silas said. "Yes." "By a significant margin." "Yes." "And one ranch, one voice." She looked at him. "That's the structure." "I know it's the structure." He paused. "I built it with you." It was the first time he had said something like that. She looked at him, and he was already looking at the window, which was the Silas Brandt method of saying something that cost him something without letting you watch it cost him. "You did," she said. "Well, the agreement came back from Dillard signed on Wednesday, as she'd predicted to Silas she would, and with it came a separate letter, not to the network, but to Elena personally, that contained a detailed accounting of the Rourke situation, what Dillard had authorized, what Rourke had decided independently, and what the aftermath had been. It was thorough and specific, and she read it twice. She didn't know with certainty where the truth fell between Dillard's accounting and what she'd experienced on that mountain, and she probably never would. But she filed the letter and she moved forward, because the alternative to moving forward was standing in a frozen pass indefinitely, and she had never been built for that. What she was built for was the next thing. And the next thing was 32 participating ranches and a breeding pool that now included the finest bull lines in the territory and a collective selling arrangement that had shifted the market dynamic of the county irreversibly. The buyers understood this now. Garrett, who handled the primary accounts, came to his quarterly meeting in October with current district rates already calculated and the adjustment figures prepared, which was a thing that had never happened in the previous arrangement with Harmon and Cade. He sat across from Elena and Colton and presented his terms with the manner of someone operating in a genuine negotiation rather than a ritual extraction. "The spring volume projection," Elena said, looking at his figures. "You've calculated on last year's head count. The network has grown by 9 operations since last spring." Garrett made a note. He didn't argue. He revised the projection in front of them. The revised number was significantly better. "That works," Elena said. "I thought it might," Garrett said, with the dry humor of a man who has made his peace with a new reality and found it professionally tolerable. The contract was signed by November. When Elena added it to the ledger later that evening, she ran the comparison against the original Harmon and Cade rates from the first ledger she'd read in her first week on the ranch, the one that had shown the 15% undercut that nobody had been addressing. The difference between those rates and the current ones, applied across the network's combined volume, was a number that stopped her pencil mid-calculation. She sat with it. Colton came in and she showed him the number without explaining it. He looked at it. "Is that right?" "Per year, across the network." He was quiet. "That's what we were leaving on the table," she said. "Every year, before." He looked at the number for another moment. Then he looked at her. "You knew it was something like this when you first read the ledger," he said, "in the first week." "I knew it was significant. I didn't know the exact scale." She looked at the number again. "It's more than I thought." "And you sold your mother's jewelry to start the breeding experiment." She had, in fact, sold her mother's jewelry, the small, plain silver pieces she'd brought from Mill Haven, to finance the first crossbreeding trial before Silas had agreed to the network financing. It was an early experiment, modest in scale, that had provided the proof-of-concept data she'd used in the Oaks application meeting. She had not mentioned the jewelry to Colton at the time. She had not mentioned it since. "How did you know about it?" she said. "Decker told me. 2 months after it happened." He paused. "He was trying to make a point about you. I wasn't sure what point exactly. I don't think he was sure whether to be critical or not." "What point did you take from it?" He looked at her. "That you put everything you had into this. From the start. Before anyone had given you any reason to believe it would work." He paused. "I've thought about that a lot. What it takes to do that." She looked at the ledger. "I didn't have much to lose." "That's not why you did it." She was quiet. "No," she said, "it's not." What she had done it for was harder to state cleanly, and she had turned it over enough times to have gotten close to the truth of it. She had done it because not doing it meant accepting that her presence here was exactly what Silas had originally intended it to be: transactional, peripheral, a function rather than a person. And she had known from the first ledger that accepting that was the one thing she genuinely could not do. Not from pride exactly. from something more fundamental than pride, from the simple knowledge that she had something to offer and that the offering of it was the only version of herself she was interested in being. The jewelry had bought the first breeding trial, and the breeding trial had bought the credibility for the network conversation. And the network conversation had bought 32 signed agreements, and the 32 signed agreements had bought a number in a ledger that was larger than she'd expected. She didn't say any of that. She closed the ledger. "We should replace them," Colton said. "The jewelry?" "Yes. They were my mother's." "I know." He said it simply, without performing the weight of it. "We can't replace that. But you could have something of your own." She looked at him. He was not a demonstrative man, never had been, and she had stopped expecting demonstration years before and started reading the language he actually used, which was specific and quiet and more reliable than performance. "All right," she said. "What?" The hard winter came again in their third year, as hard winters do on the frontier with the indifferent regularity of things that don't require permission. This one was not as catastrophic as the first, partly because the network's emergency feed reserves were now properly established, partly because the grazing rotation meant no single operation was overexposed to a single pasture, and partly because Colton had spent 2 years refining the cold weather protocols based on what they'd learned from Alderman Pass. 3 of the smaller network ranches had difficult seasons. The Lund family, north of the Cooper Ridge, lost a quarter of their herd to a cold snap that came 2 weeks earlier than predicted. Elena restructured their account the way she'd restructured Oaks's in the first year, converting the emergency cost to a breeding pool share, giving them a foundation to rebuild from rather than a debt to rebuild under. Martha Lund came to the ranch in February to settle the restructured account, and she sat across from Elena in the kitchen, the same kitchen where so many of these conversations had happened, and she signed the documents, and she sat for a moment after with her hands in her lap. "My husband says you saved us," she said. "I want to say it myself. You saved us." "The network," Elena started. "I know what you're going to say," Martha Lund said. "The network saved us. But the network is you." "That's not the same as saying it's only you." "But the network wouldn't exist without you, and we all know it. And I wanted to say thank you in a room where there's nobody else. So it's just a person saying thank you to another person." Elena was quiet. She had gotten better at receiving gratitude over the years. Not entirely comfortable. She suspected she never would be entirely comfortable with it, but better, she'd learned that refusing gratitude was its own form of dismissal, that it told the person offering it that what they felt wasn't warranted, and that was its own small injury. "You're welcome," she said. "Come back to me in the spring about the South Pasture rotation. I have a thought about your water access timing that might help." Martha Lund smiled. It was the smile of someone who has been helped and knows they'll be helped again and understands that the helping is the point, not the obligation it creates. Silas's health began declining in the 4th winter with the quiet inevitability of a man who has spent 60 years treating his body as a tool and is finally accounting for the accumulated cost. He didn't complain. Complaining was not available to him in any meaningful sense, but Elena watched him slow over the course of the season with the attentiveness she brought to anything she wanted to understand. She brought the ledgers to him when he was confined to the house, not because he needed to review them. She and Colton managed the operation fully by then, but because she understood that the ledgers were how he stayed connected to the thing he'd built, and that connection mattered to him, and she knew what it was to need something to hold on to. He went through the figures with the careful attention he'd always brought to them, sometimes making notes in the margin, sometimes asking questions that went to the heart of a projection she'd been uncertain about herself. The questions were good. She always answered them directly, and sometimes the answering of them changed the projection. "The Eastern Corridor," he said one afternoon, with the accounts for the meridian rotation open in front of him. "You've been cautious about it. The terrain limits the rotation cycle. I wrote it in 1869, he said. There's a water source about 2 miles north of the meridian boundary that doesn't show on any survey. Creek, runs year-round. I think it's fed by the ridge drainage." He paused. "If it's still running, it changes the rotation geometry." She looked at him. "You've never mentioned this." "Nobody asked about the Eastern Corridor for 22 years. He looked at the map. "Now you're asking about it. I'm mentioning it." She had Colton ride out to verify it the next week. The creek was there, year-round, as Silas had said. and the rotation geometry it enabled was better than anything she'd been working with. She revised the meridian projections, and the revision was significant enough that she brought it to Silas and showed him the adjusted numbers. He looked at them. He looked at her. "Better," he said. "Yes." "You should have asked me sooner." "You should have offered sooner." He made the sound she'd heard twice in 4 years, the one that was unmistakably a laugh. It was weaker than the previous times, the laugh of a man whose lungs were doing less than they used to, but it was genuine. "Fair," he said. He died in the 5th year's early winter. He went the way he'd lived, without making more of it than it was, which was hard and real, and his. Elena sat in the office the day after the funeral, and she let herself feel what she felt, which was complicated in the way that all feelings about people who have done you wrong and then done right by you are complicated. There was grief. There was the particular grief of someone who had started as an adversary and ended as something she didn't have a clean word for. Not family, exactly. Not quite ally. Something in the space between that she'd built herself through the specific work of showing up every day and doing the thing that needed doing. She thought about the coffee cups on the floor, the ledgers sent to her room, his name on the charter beside hers. She thought, people are not what they start as, if you give them enough time and enough reason. That wasn't always true. It hadn't been true for Rourke, but it had been true for Silas, and it had been true for Decker, and it had been true for Reed Caswell, and in her better moments she believed it was mostly true for most people, most of the time, when the conditions were right. Creating the right conditions was what she'd spent 5 years doing. She picked up her pencil. The Eastern Corridor rotation needed finalizing. The breeding pool's spring cycle needed confirmation. There were 2 new applications from operations she hadn't yet met with. She started working. In the 6th year, Senator Caldwell's Legislative Committee proposed the Land Consolidation Act, and Elena went to Austin. She had been expecting something like it. The network had become large enough, 41 operations, combined volume that represented a majority of the county's cattle output, that it had attracted the attention of people whose interests were served by a different arrangement. The act was carefully worded, as these things always were, but the effect was clear. It would restructure grazing rights in ways that favored large single-owner operations, making the network's cooperative structure legally cumbersome to the point of impracticality. She spent 3 weeks preparing the testimony. Not alone. Colton reviewed the operational arguments, Pruitt compiled the statistical documentation, Harlan Cooper and Thomas Oakes both wrote statements that she incorporated with their permission. But the synthesis, the presentation, the argument that would translate the network's specific economic reality into terms that a legislative committee would hear as constituency impact rather than personal preference, that she did herself, because she had learned that this particular kind of translation was one she was better at than anyone else she knew. She went to Austin with figures and signed statements from 41 operations and the patience of someone who has been in rooms where she wasn't expected to matter, and has learned that the way you change those rooms is not by demanding to matter, but by making it impossible to ignore the material consequences of not listening. Caldwell's committee received her on a Thursday morning. There were 6 committee members, and they had the generally distracted air of men who had scheduled a courtesy and expected it to run its course without disturbing anything. She spoke for 2 hours. She was not passionate, she was not personal, she was specific, and she was thorough, and she was unflinching about the numbers. And the numbers told a story that the room could not help but hear, because the numbers were about the operations those 41 ranches represented, and the families those operations supported, and the tax contribution that translated into the county's practical capacity to fund everything from road maintenance to school buildings. Midway through the second hour, one of the committee members who had been taking notes stopped taking notes and started asking questions. The questions were good, the kind that go to the heart of the structural argument rather than the surface of the political one, and she answered them directly, and the answers produced more questions, and by the time the session ended, they had been in conversation for nearly 2 hours and 40 minutes. The Consolidation Act passed with a provision that explicitly protected cooperative network structures from the new grazing regulations. It was not everything she'd wanted. The Eastern Corridor concession remained, and she spent 3 hours with Colton working through the rotation adjustments it required. But the network was protected, and the protection was structural, written into territorial law in a way that future administrations would have to actively work to undo. She came home on a Friday evening and found Colton in the south pasture doing exactly what she expected. And she told him what had happened, and he asked about the compromises. And she explained the Eastern Corridor adjustment, and he said he'd look at terrain options, and that was the entire conversation. It was enough. It was exactly enough. Years accumulated the way years do. Not smoothly, not without cost, but with the specific texture of time that has been used well. The network grew to 60 operations across 4 counties. The breeding pool produced a generation of cattle that other territories began studying as a model. The combined market arrangement stabilized pricing across the region in a way that benefited not just the participants, but the broader economy of every town whose livelihood depended on the cattle trade. Dora Hatch's ranch fully recovered in the 4th year, and she sold it in the 6th, not in defeat, but to her son, who ran it with the particular ferocity his mother had modeled, and who was one of the most reliable participants in the network. Dora herself came to the annual cattlemen's meeting every year until she was 81, and she sat in the front row and asked questions that nobody else asked and offered observations that required 30 years of experience to make. Thomas Oakes left the eastern parcel to his son and retained the western one himself into his late 60s, working it with a slowness that was different from laziness and the same in its results. He and his wife had Elena and Colton to dinner that first spring, and then every spring after, and the dinner table became one of the places where Elena understood, incrementally and without announcement, that she had built something here that went beyond ledgers and agreements and headcounts. She had built a place for herself, not the place she'd been given, the one she'd made. The Caswell brothers, Reed and Marcus, eventually split their operation into 2 independent ranches, which the network accommodated. Reed came to Elena the day the split was finalized, and he did what he had not been built to do easily, but did anyway. He said thank you. Specifically, without preamble, without dressing it in something else. The winter of the drive, he said. If we'd been outside the network, we'd have lost everything. I knew it then, and I couldn't say it then. I'm saying it now. Better late, Elena said, than without meaning it. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, an acknowledgement of the accuracy of that, and of the grace with which it had been offered. Yes, he said. Better late. Harlan Cooper never became warm exactly. Warmth was not in his constitution any more than it was in Silas's. But he became something more valuable, which was reliable. He showed up at every meeting, contributed to every collective decision, rode to every emergency that the network's mutual support structure required, and never once asked for more than what the agreement entitled him to. He was the person Elena cited when people from other counties came to ask how the network held together over time, as the model of what participation actually required. Someone who understood that the agreement was only as strong as the people in it, and who chose, every day, to be that kind of person. In the 11th year, a young woman arrived at the Brant Ranch with a letter in her hand. Her name was Frances, and she was 22, and she had some education and considerable ability and exactly as much money as Elena had had when she'd arrived in Calvary 14 years earlier, which was not enough. She had heard about the network operations office, and she had applied for a position as a bookkeeper, and she had, in her application letter, included an analysis of the Eastern Corridor rotation based on the publicly available network documentation that demonstrated she understood the system at a structural level. Elena read the letter twice. She read the rotation analysis 3 times. She sat across from Frances in the front room and looked at her. The stillness, the directness, the way she held herself in a room where she wasn't sure of her reception. The Eastern Corridor analysis, Elena said. You said the current rotation cycle is suboptimal. Yes. Tell me why. Frances told her. She was specific and accurate, and her analysis was built on sound reasoning, and one of her conclusions was wrong. Not badly wrong, but wrong in the way that happens when you're working from public documentation rather than operational knowledge. And Elena told her which conclusion and why, and Frances adjusted her position without defensiveness, incorporating the correction immediately into a revised analysis that she articulated on the spot. Elena looked at her. What are you hoping for here? Elena said. Not as a challenge, as a genuine question. Frances looked at her directly. I want to understand how this works from the inside, she said. The network. I've studied it from the outside and I understand the structure, but I don't understand the decisions. Why you built it the way you did instead of other ways. What the early choices were. What failed before things worked. I want to understand the actual thing, not the documented version of it. That's a lot to want from a bookkeeping position. I know. Francis paused. But I think the bookkeeping is the right place to start. The numbers are where the actual decisions live. Elena was quiet. She thought about a fence rail and a set of ledgers sent to a guest room by a boy who wouldn't meet her eyes. She thought about 3 in the morning and 4 sheets of paper and lines drawn between things nobody had thought to connect. She thought about what it had taken and what it had cost and what it had built, and she thought about the specific nature of that kind of wanting. The wanting that is not ambition exactly, but the need to understand how things actually work, and then the inability not to try to make them work better. She recognized it the way you recognize something you've seen in the mirror every morning for years. Monday, she said. Come in the morning. Bring the Eastern Corridor analysis, the revised version. We'll go through the full rotation together, operational data included, and you can tell me where your analysis changes. Francis looked at her with the expression of someone who has been offered what they asked for and is discovering that what they asked for is real. Monday, she said. She left, and Elena sat in the front room in the quiet of a late afternoon, with the sound of the cattle in the south pasture and the Pedernales running at a good level and the Brandt banner moving in the wind above the operation that she and Colton ran together under both their names on every document that mattered. Colton appeared in the doorway. New bookkeeper? He said. New something, Elena said. I'm not sure what yet. He looked at her. He had learned to read her face over 14 years with an accuracy that occasionally startled her. She reminded you of yourself. She reminded me of what I needed when I needed it. She paused. The difference is someone was here to give it to her. He was quiet for a moment. That's the point, isn't it? He said. Not a question. The recognition of something they'd been building toward for a long time that had just found its plain statement. That's the point, she said. That is the point. Not the legacy, not the empire, not the number in the ledger or the banner above the gate, or the 60 operations that carried the network into a future Elena would not live to see in full. The point was the door being opened for the next person who arrived without one. The point was the ledgers being made available before they were asked for. The point was showing up at 3 in the morning with a blank piece of paper and drawing lines between things, and then spending every year after teaching someone else how to see those lines, so that the next person didn't have to find them alone in the dark. Elena Brandt had arrived in Calvary County with nothing but her mind, her mother's jewelry, and the refusal to accept the terms she'd been handed. She built something that outlasted the people who had doubted her, and something that outlasted, honestly, even the people who had believed in her. She built something that became its own argument for what was possible. She did not do it perfectly. She made errors that cost real things. 11 animals on a mountain, a legislative concession she still believed was wrong. Relationships she handled clumsily in the early years before she understood that being right about the numbers didn't automatically make her right about the people. She was not easy to know in the way that some people are easy to know. She was not soft with herself or with the work or with the gap between what she'd intended and what she'd achieved. But she did not stop. That was the whole of it in the end. She did not stop when Silas's office was closed to her, or when the hands dismissed her, or when the ranching wives arranged the conversation around her absence, or when rifles cracked in a mountain tree line and her horse was sliding on ice and 600 animals were in panic on a frozen slope. She did not stop because stopping was not in the range of choices she was willing to make, not because she was exceptional, but because she had decided, in the first breath after the bad news, and in every breath after that the work was worth the doing. That is the truth that the ledgers hold and the network carries, and the county still knows, in the way that places know things, that the most significant changes in any landscape begin. Not with the people who have power enough to force them, but with the people who have clarity enough to see what's possible and courage enough to start building it from what they have. Elena had numbers and a blank piece of paper and the absolute unwillingness to pretend the problems weren't there.